My name is Bella Jones. I am 34 years old. If you want to know how a family shatters, you do not look at a screaming match in a driveway. You look at a quiet, air-conditioned courtroom in Maricopa County, Arizona on a Tuesday morning. That was where my parents tried to strip me of the only protection I had left. They arrived with a high-priced litigator, custom-tailored suits, and a narrative they had been polishing for 12 years. I sat alone at the respondent table. Across the aisle sat my mother, Patricia. She wore her country club best, a beige sheath dress, a silk scarf, and an expression of practiced grief. Beside her was my father, Richard. He sat with his arms crossed over his chest, radiating the unearned confidence of a man who always assumed the world would bend to his checkbook. One row back sat my older sister, Jessica, the golden child. She spent the morning checking her phone and whispering to my mother. They were here to break my Aunt Vivian and her irrevocable trust. They wanted the estate, the property, the money. To get it, they needed the judge to believe I was a fraud. Their lawyer, Harrison Sterling, paced the hardwood floor. He carried a polished arrogance that costs $1,000 an hour. He did not just argue a case, he performed it. "Your Honor," Sterling said, stopping right in front of my table, "we are dealing with a clear case of undue influence. Look at the respondent." He gestured toward me. I kept my eyes on the judge. "The respondent has no formal financial education," Sterling continued, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "She dropped out of her university path. She has no career to speak of. She has no credentials to manage an estate of this magnitude. She is, by all verifiable metrics, entirely unqualified." From the plaintiff table, my mother decided the performance needed her help. She did not whisper. She spoke at a volume designed to carry across the gallery. This one, Patricia pointed a manicured finger at me, her face twisting into a sneer. "No degree, no career. She is just uneducated and worthless." A few people in the gallery actually laughed. It was not a loud sound, just a reflexive, uncomfortable ripple. I heard my sister Jessica let out a sharp, quiet snort, covering her mouth to hide a smirk. My father nodded, adjusting his tie. They felt victorious. They had spent 12 years convincing everyone in our hometown that I was a failure, and now they were making it part of the public record. They expected me to shrink. They expected me to lower my head, fold my hands, and let their version of my life become the truth. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I let the laughter die out. I let the silence stretch until it became heavy. Then I pushed my chair back. The legs scraped against the floor. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my navy blue blazer. I looked past my parents, past Jessica and her fading smirk, and past Harrison Sterling and his stance. I looked directly at the judge. "Your Honor," I said. My voice was calm. It did not shake. "Can I tell the truth now?" I reached for the thick binder resting on the table in front of me. I did not bring a lawyer to speak for me. I did not need one. I opened the rings, pulled out a single sheet of corporate letterhead, and handed it to the bailiff to pass to Mr. Sterling. What happened in the next 60 seconds broke my family facade forever. When Harrison Sterling looked down and read the actual name of my firm, the blood drained from his face. His expensive leather folder slipped from his fingers, hitting the floor with a loud smack. If you enjoy stories about justice and family boundaries, welcome to Grape Vengeance. Take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Before we continue, drop a comment and let me know your age and where you are watching from right now. I love reading your responses. To understand why a piece of paper made a ruthless lawyer drop his files, I need to take you back 12 years, to the day my family priced my worth and the moment I decided to build an empire in the dark. I grew up in Scottsdale, Arizona. My home was a sprawling stucco house with a terracotta roof and a manicured lawn that required constant watering to survive the punishing desert sun. It was the perfect metaphor for my parents. Everything required expensive, artificial upkeep just to look good from the street. My father, Richard, was a mid-level manager at a regional insurance firm. He spent his weekends chasing promotions he never earned on the pristine greens of the Desert Mountain Golf Club. He cared about the brand of his polo shirts, the lease on his imported sedan, and making sure the men in his foursome thought he was wealthy. My mother, Patricia, treated the local country club social committee like a full-time career. Her entire self-worth hinged on where she was seated at charity luncheons and whether her neighbors noticed her new jewelry. Then there was my sister, Jessica. She was 2 years older than me, and she was the undisputed golden child of the Jones household. Jessica had my mother's blonde hair, my father's talent for taking credit, and an uncanny ability to demand things without ever sounding like she was asking. She never held a summer job. She never paid for her own car insurance. She floated through high school and college on a cushion of parental subsidies. I was the invisible one. I spent my teenage years bussing tables at a diner on Camelback Road. I worked night shifts, saved my tips in a shoebox, and paid for my own clothes. I stayed in my room and studied financial markets accounting principles and corporate law. I learned very early that if I wanted anything in this world, I would have to finance it myself. But I had one safety net, or at least I thought I did. Before my paternal grandparents passed away, they set up a custodial college fund for me. They deposited $60,000 into an account meant to cover my university tuition. Richard was the named custodian. I tracked the account diligently. By the summer I turned 22, the interest had brought the total to $68,412. It was my ticket out of Scottsdale. It was my chance to build a real future. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday in early June. It was a thick envelope from a highly prestigious finance and asset management program in Chicago. They accepted only 30 students a year. I had beaten the odds. I held that heavy cream paper in my hands and felt a genuine thrill of hope. All the late nights at the diner, all the hours spent reading balance sheets while my peers were at pool parties, had finally paid off. I just needed my father to sign the custodial transfer authorization to release the funds. I walked into the kitchen holding the letter. The air conditioning was humming loudly, fighting against the 110-degree heat outside. My family was gathered around the large granite island. Richard was scrolling through golf scores on his tablet. Patricia was addressing thick, expensive wedding invitations with a calligraphy pen. Jessica sat on a bar stool flipping through a bridal magazine. Sitting next to her was David, her fiancé. David was a man who wore expensive cologne and cheap shoes. He possessed no actual skills, but he had a bright smile and a smooth pitch. He wanted to open a luxury auto dealership. He had no business plan, no market research, and no inventory. He just wanted to be the guy who owned a dealership. Richard adored him because David played golf and laughed at all of Richard's jokes. I set the acceptance letter on the granite counter near my father. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I got in. The finance program in Chicago accepted me. I need you to sign the release for Grandma and Grandpa's fund so I can secure my enrollment spot by Friday." Richard did not look up from his tablet. He reached for his iced tea, took a slow sip, and set the glass down on a coaster. "That is not going to work out, Bella," he said. I stared at him. The hum of the refrigerator suddenly sounded very loud. "What do you mean it is not going to work out? The deadline is Friday." My father finally looked up. His eyes held no warmth, no pride, no apology. "We drained that account yesterday," he said. The words did not process right away. I looked at the heavy cream envelope on the counter. I looked at my mother, who continued writing a zip code in swirling blue ink. I looked at David, who suddenly found his phone very interesting. "You drained it?" I asked. My voice dropped to a whisper. "That was my money. Grandma left it for my education." Jessica sighed loudly and closed her bridal magazine. "Stop being dramatic, Bella," she said, rolling her eyes. Richard crossed his arms over his chest. "Jessica's wedding is next month in Cabo. The catering costs went over budget, and David needs seed money to secure the lease on his dealership lot." I felt the blood leave my face. "You stole my college fund to pay for a vacation and a failed business venture?" David shifted uncomfortably on his stool but said nothing. He let my father defend his theft. "Watch your tone in this house," Richard snapped. "I was the custodian on that account. I make the financial decisions. Family takes care of family. David is about to be my son-in-law. His dealership is going to put this family on the map. I turned to my mother. She was the one who managed the household books. She knew exactly what that money meant to me. Mom, I pleaded, tell him he cannot do this. I earned this spot. Patricia set down her calligraphy pen. She looked at me with an expression of cold, clinical evaluation, the kind of look a person gives a broken appliance before throwing it away. Your father made the right call, Patricia said. Her voice was smooth and even. We have to allocate our resources where they make the most sense. Resources. I was not a daughter. I was a misplaced asset. David does not even have a supply chain, I said, my voice rising now. He is going to lose every penny of that $68,000 in 6 months. And a wedding in Cabo is not an investment. It is a party. You stole my future for a party. Patricia stood up. Her chair scraped sharply against the tile floor. She did not raise her voice. She did not have to. If you cannot support your sister, Patricia said, then you have no place in this house. I thought it was an empty threat, a harsh rhetorical tactic designed to end the argument. But Patricia marched out of the kitchen and headed straight for the stairs. I stood frozen by the island. Richard went back to looking at his tablet. Jessica patted David on the arm and whispered something to him. None of them looked at me. It was as if I had already ceased to exist. 10 minutes later, the heavy thud of footsteps echoed on the stairs. Patricia returned. She was not carrying my suitcases. She was carrying 3 black plastic garbage bags. They bulged with my clothes, my books, my shoes. She dragged them past the kitchen, opened the front door, and shoved them out onto the porch. One of the bags caught on the doorframe and tore open. A pair of my jeans and a notebook spilled out onto the hot concrete. I followed her to the door. The Arizona heat hit me like an open oven, suffocating and dry. Pick up your mess and leave, Patricia said, standing in the doorway. I looked at the trash bags baking in the sun. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. You are throwing me out because I asked for my own money? Patricia crossed her arms. Her face was a mask of perfect, untroubled certainty. Jessica is an investment, she said coldly. You are just a liability. She closed the door. I heard the deadbolt click into place. I stood on the porch in the blistering heat. I did not bang on the wood. I did not shout through the windows. I knelt down on the burning concrete, gathered my spilled jeans and my notebook, and stuffed them back into the torn plastic bag. I dragged my belongings to my 10-year-old Honda Civic parked on the street. The steering wheel was so hot it burned my palms. I started the engine and turned the air conditioning on full blast, but it only blew warm, dusty air. I drove away from the stucco house with the terracotta roof. I did not cry. Crying was a response to heartbreak, and my heart was not broken. It was recalibrated. In a single afternoon, my family had taught me the exact rules of their game. Love was a balance sheet. Loyalty was a transaction. And I had just been liquidated. I pointed my car toward Tempe, where the rents were cheap and the diners were always hiring. I had no degree, no safety net, and no family. But I had my mind, and I had time. If they wanted to view me as a financial variable, I would become the most dangerous variable they had ever created. I decided right there, sweating in the driver's seat of my terrible car, that I would build something they could never touch. I would learn every rule of the finance world they worshipped. I just did not know yet that 3 years later, Jessica's golden life would begin to rot, and the very people who threw me away would come hunting for the empire I was about to build in the dark. My first apartment was a cramped studio in Tempe. The air conditioning broke every Tuesday, rattling like a box of loose screws, before blowing warm, dusty air across my mattress on the floor. Rent cost exactly my entire paycheck from the diner on Apache Boulevard, where I worked the graveyard shift. I wore a polyester uniform that permanently smelled of bleach and old coffee. I served pancakes to truck drivers and tired college students at 3 a.m. I kept my head down, cleared the plates, and pocketed the crumpled single dollars left on the Formica tables. People expect you to break when your own parents throw you away like household trash. They expect phone calls filled with begging. They expect apologies for things you never did. I offered none of that. Rock bottom has a very solid foundation. You cannot fall any further, which means every step you take only goes up. I did not shed tears over Richard and Patricia. I spent my grief on that hot concrete porch in Scottsdale. By the time I signed the lease on that studio, my mind was crystal clear. I needed to understand the mechanics of the world my father worshipped. Richard respected wealth, but he only understood the performance of it. He leased cars he could barely afford and bought country club memberships on credit. I wanted to understand the actual machinery of money. I took the tips from the diner, deposited them at a local credit union, and paid for online certification courses. Forensic accounting, corporate restructuring, asset management, hostile debt acquisition. While other people my age were going to parties or taking weekend trips, I sat on the floor of my apartment under a single bare light bulb. I learned how to read a balance sheet the way some people read novels. I learned how companies hide their vulnerabilities. I studied how failing businesses try to mask their impending ruin with new loans. Every ledger told a story of leverage, weakness, and power. I realized that the same principles applied to families like mine. My parents operated on a deficit of genuine affection, masking their moral bankruptcy with expensive weddings and catered dinners. They were over-leveraged. It was only a matter of time before their debt came due. The only person from my past who bothered to track me down was Aunt Vivian. She was my father's older sister, a retired high school principal who lived quietly in a mid-century house in Phoenix. Richard rarely spoke to her because she drove a 10-year-old sedan and refused to join his social circle. She saw right through his tailored suits and his golf scores. 3 months after I moved to Tempe, I heard a knock on my apartment door. I opened it to find Vivian standing in the hallway holding her worn leather purse. She stepped inside, looking at the mattress on the floor, the stack of accounting textbooks, the broken air conditioning vent. She did not offer empty sympathy. She did not tell me that my parents meant well. She sat down on the thrift store couch I had bought for $10 and opened her purse. Vivian pulled out a cashier check and placed it on the small folding table between us. I looked at the number printed across the center, $5,000. It was more money than I had ever seen at one time. "I know what Richard and Patricia did," Vivian said. Her voice was steady, carrying a quiet, fierce anger that she usually kept hidden. "They stole your future to fund a party. They discarded you because you demanded what was yours." I stared at the check. "I cannot take this, Aunt Vivian. This is your retirement money." She reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. Her grip was firm, anchoring me to the room. "You will take it, Bella. You will use it to get out of that diner uniform. You are going to build something they can never touch, and you are going to do it so well that one day they will have to look up just to see your shoes." I took the money. I promised her I would make it count. That $5,000 became the seed capital for everything that followed. The next morning, I walked into the State Corporation Commission office and filed the paperwork. I chose the name Cactus Financial LLC. A cactus survives in the most brutal, unforgiving environments. It requires almost nothing to live, and it grows sharp defenses to protect its core. It felt fitting. I listed myself as the sole managing partner. I built my firm in total secrecy. I did not create a flashy website. I did not post motivational quotes on social media. I did not update my employment status on any public platform. In my family, visibility was a liability. If Richard or Patricia found out I was starting a business, they would mock it until it failed. If it succeeded, they would demand a share of the profits, claiming they raised me to be an entrepreneur. They would twist my success into their own achievement. So I became a ghost. I worked 18 hours a day. I took on small freelance accounting jobs for local contractors, cleaning up their messy ledgers. I used those earnings to buy software and access to commercial debt databases. I started tracking distressed assets. I looked for small businesses that were drowning in loans they could not pay, and I offered restructuring plans for a fee. When I landed my first major corporate client, a logistics company in Mesa that needed a forensic audit to uncover embezzlement, I moved out of the Tempe studio. I rented a small, unmarked office in a commercial park in Phoenix. I bought a solid desk, a good chair, and a secure server. I drove the same 10-year-old Honda Civic. I wore plain navy blazers bought on clearance. No one looking at me would ever guess that I was managing millions of dollars in corporate restructuring deals. Years passed. I hired my first employee, a brilliant but introverted data analyst named Marcus, who preferred spreadsheets to human interaction. Then I hired a paralegal, then a junior accountant. Cactus Financial grew from a single desk into a dedicated suite of offices. We acquired portfolios of bad debt from regional banks, turning toxic loans into profitable restructuring opportunities. My personal net worth crossed the seven-figure mark before my 28th birthday. I celebrated by taking Aunt Vivian out for a quiet dinner at a steakhouse. We raised glasses of sparkling water. She smiled at me across the white tablecloth, her eyes bright with pride. "They still think you are waiting tables," she mentioned, casually cutting into her filet. "Richard told our cousin last week that you probably joined a cult or moved to a commune." I took a sip of my drink. Let them think whatever keeps them comfortable. That was the beauty of my silence. It functioned as an impenetrable shield. While I was acquiring commercial real estate deeds and securing hostile takeovers, my parents were busy forgetting I existed. They were too preoccupied with their own facade to notice the empire rising right in their own backyard. I kept tabs on them not out of longing, but out of professional curiosity. I treated my family like a volatile stock. I watched from a distance as they poured resources into Jessica's life. David opened his luxury auto dealership with my stolen college fund. For the first 2 years, they posted endless photos of champagne toasts, ribbon-cutting ceremonies, and leased sports cars. Jessica walked around Scottsdale wearing designer brands, playing the role of the successful executive wife. Richard bragged about his son-in-law to anyone who would listen at the Desert Mountain Golf Club. But I knew how to read the underlying data. A business built on stolen money and unearned confidence is a house built on sand. David possessed a salesman charm but lacked operational discipline. He spent revenue on inventory he could not move. He took out high-interest loans to cover payroll. Jessica treated the business account like a personal slush fund, withdrawing thousands for European vacations and boutique shopping sprees to maintain her image among her wealthy friends. I saw the warning signs long before the banks did. The cracks in their perfect facade started showing. By my 30th birthday, Cactus Financial employed 45 elite professionals. We occupied a sprawling corporate headquarters in downtown Phoenix. My name remained absent from our public-facing materials. I was B. Jones Managing Partner, a signature on lucrative contracts and acquisition deeds. My parents continued to live in their stucco house, ignorant of the fact that the daughter they threw away now held enough capital to buy their entire neighborhood. I assumed we would simply live out our lives on parallel tracks, never intersecting. I planned to remain a ghost to them forever. But financial gravity always catches up with people who live beyond their means. The dealership fragile numbers finally collapsed under the weight of David's incompetence and Jessica's greed. The creditors stopped calling with polite reminders and started filing aggressive liens. The luxury cars were repossessed in the middle of the night. The bank threatened to seize the building. Panic strips away pride very quickly. When the golden child life shattered the country club's smiles, vanished. Desperation set in, and suddenly, after years of total silence, Patricia remembered she had another daughter. I was sitting in my corner office reviewing an acquisition proposal when my private cell phone buzzed. I looked down at the screen. The caller ID displayed a number I had not seen in almost a decade. My mother was calling. She did not want to apologize. She wanted a bailout, and the conversation we were about to have would change the dynamic of our family forever. 3 years is a significant duration to pretend you are wealthy. It takes a staggering amount of energy to sustain a fiction, and my parents were exhausting themselves to keep their narrative alive in the desert. David's luxury auto dealership lasted exactly 36 months. He possessed the swagger of a successful man, but none of the discipline required to maintain a ledger. He stocked his showroom with imported European sports cars he acquired on high-interest credit. He treated the business accounts like a personal checking fund, pulling cash to pay for Jessica's country club luncheons, her designer wardrobe, and their frequent weekend trips to Napa Valley. He loved the title of owner, but he loathed the daily grind of actual work. When the supply chain shifted and the interest rates climbed, his inventory sat gathering dust under the scorching Arizona sun. The lenders stopped accepting his smooth excuses over the phone. They demanded their payments. Within weeks, the transport trucks arrived in the dead of night to repossess the unsold vehicles. David filed for bankruptcy before the end of the fiscal quarter, leaving a trail of unpaid contractors and furious investors in his wake. In a functional family, a failed business represents a hard lesson. In my family, it was a social catastrophe that needed immediate burial. Richard and Patricia could not stomach the idea of their country club peers whispering about David's insolvency over tennis matches and charity dinners. To save face, my father drove to his bank and signed a second mortgage on their pristine stucco home. He pulled out hundreds of thousands of dollars in equity, tying his own financial survival directly to a man who had just proven he could not manage a dime. They used the equity to settle David's immediate debts and quiet the local gossip. But they did not stop there. Jessica needed a new title to maintain her elite image among her friends. She convinced my parents that retail was her true calling, claiming she had an eye for fashion that would guarantee success. They funded her next vanity project without asking to see a single business plan or profit projection. Jessica signed a commercial lease for a high-end clothing boutique in Old Town Scottsdale. The monthly rent alone was astronomical. She ordered silk garments and imported leather handbags, stocking the racks with items she personally wanted to wear rather than what the local market demanded. She hired 2 full-time managers to run the register so she could drop in for an hour a day, sip sparkling water, and call herself a founder. The boutique bled cash from the day the doors opened. She hosted lavish launch parties, paying for premium catering and photographers, while ignoring the mounting stack of past due notices on her desk. 10 months later, the eviction notices were taped to the glass storefront. The clothing vendors sued for unpaid invoices. The second mortgage my father took out was entirely gone, burned on wholesale velvet dresses and expensive retail display cases that ended up in a liquidation warehouse. The financial gravity they had ignored for years finally dragged them down to the pavement. The bank started calling my father's personal cell phone, demanding the mortgage arrears. The credit cards maxed out. They had spent their pride, their equity, and their future to prop up the golden child, and the golden child had left them holding an empty bag. Panic changes the way people operate. It strips away their pride and forces them to look for lifeboats they previously despised. My phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. I was sitting at my solid oak desk in my Phoenix office. I had just finished reviewing a restructuring strategy for a failing logistics firm. My personal cell phone vibrated against the wood, disrupting the quiet hum of the air conditioning. I looked at the screen and saw my mother's number flashing brightly. 3 years had passed since Patricia shoved my belongings into garbage bags and locked the front door. 3 years of unbroken silence. She had not called on my birthdays. She had not called on holidays. I was a ghost to them until the moment their funds ran dry. I picked up the device and pressed accept. I did not say hello. I just waited, letting the line stay open. Bella. Patricia used a tone I recognized instantly. It was the careful, measured warmth she usually reserved for the country club admissions board. It was a voice engineered to extract a favor without sounding desperate. "Yes," I said, keeping my tone flat. She let out a heavy sigh, acting as though we spoke every week. "Your father and I have been going through a very tough season. We did not want to worry you, but David had some bad luck with the market. The dealership closed, and Jessica's boutique hit a rough patch. We stepped in to help them, and now the bank is being unreasonable about our mortgage." She paused, expecting me to rush in with offers of sympathy or assistance. I looked at the financial projections glowing on my computer monitor. I remained quiet, forcing her to bear the weight of the silence. "We need you to transfer your savings to us by Friday," Patricia continued, dropping the artificial warmth for practical instruction, "just to cover the arrears and get the bank off our backs. Family takes care of family, Bella. It is time you stepped up and remembered that. Family takes care of family." She wielded that phrase like a scalpel, attempting to carve out my guilt. She assumed I was still a waitress, hiding in a Tempe studio apartment, living paycheck to paycheck. She assumed I had a few $1,000s scraped together in a basic checking account, and she felt entitled to take every cent of it to shield Jessica from the consequences of her own actions. She did not know she was speaking to a woman who currently controlled 8 figures in corporate capital. I leaned back in my leather chair. I looked at the framed photograph of Aunt Vivian on my shelf, remembering the fierce, protective gleam in her eyes when she handed me that initial check. I thought about the cream-colored acceptance letter I had placed on the granite kitchen island 3 years ago, and the cold way Patricia had declared me a liability. "I have the money, Mom," I said. My voice was calm, holding no anger and no edge, just a statement of fact. I heard her exhale a shaky breath of relief. "Oh, thank goodness. If you wire it tomorrow, Richard can call the bank manager and negotiate. I am not giving you a single cent," I said, cutting off her planning with surgical precision. The line went dead quiet. I could hear the faint sound of a television playing a daytime talk show in the background on her end. "Excuse me," Patricia snapped. The country club warmth vanished, replaced by the harsh, demanding register she used when she felt defied by a subordinate. "We are on the verge of losing the house." "You chose your investment," I replied. "You decided Jessica was the asset and I was the liability. You funded a destination wedding, a dealership, and a retail boutique. You allocated your resources exactly where you wanted them. Those investments failed. That is your reality to manage, not mine." I heard the phone fumble. A scuffling sound echoed through the speaker, followed by heavy, ragged breathing. My father had snatched the receiver from her hand. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat," Richard screamed. His volume distorted the audio, making the phone speaker crackle. "We raised you. We put a roof over your head. You owe this family. If you do not wire that money right now, you are dead to us. Do you hear me? You are no daughter of mine." He used the same threat he had deployed 3 years ago, expecting it to terrify me into submission. He thought the idea of losing their conditional love would force me into compliance. He did not understand that the threat had lost all its power the day I drove away from their house with my life packed in garbage bags. "I do hear you, Richard," I said, stripping him of his parental title. I tapped the red button on my screen and ended the call. I opened my phone settings, navigated to their contact files, and blocked both of their numbers. I did the same for Jessica and David. I severed the digital lines the same way they had severed the emotional ones. I placed the phone face down on my desk. I sat in the quiet of my office and waited for the grief to hit. I expected to feel the sting of rejection. I expected the younger version of myself to mourn the fact that my parents had just formally disowned me for a second time, choosing their pride over my presence. The tears never materialized. Instead, a profound, undeniable sense of lightness washed over my shoulders. The air in the room felt cleaner. The tension I had carried in my jaw since childhood dissolved. The silence that filled my office was not empty or lonely. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated peace. I had stopped performing for people who only viewed me as an emergency fund. I had stopped hoping they would wake up and recognize my worth. By refusing to fund their facade, I had finally cut the last chain binding me to their failures. They wanted me to be small so they could feel big. I was done shrinking. I turned my attention back to my computer screen. I had a corporate restructuring deal to finalize before noon. Cactus Financial was expanding, actively acquiring distressed debt from over-leveraged entities across the Southwest. I was building an empire, and I needed my focus sharp. I did not know it then, but blocking their numbers did not mean our paths would never intersect again. It simply meant that the next time they saw me, They would not be dealing with a daughter seeking their approval. They would be dealing with a creditor holding the legal deed to their ruin. And the catalyst for that final collision would come from the only person in my family who actually understood the value of a quiet, strategic investment. 8 years is a massive span of time to hold a grudge. I chose not to carry mine. I weaponized it instead. My enterprise grew from a rickety folding table inside a sweltering Tempe studio into a sprawling corporate operation. We eventually occupied the top 2 floors of a sleek glass high-rise in downtown Phoenix. The broken air conditioning of my youth was replaced by climate-controlled suites and panoramic views of the desert skyline. I transitioned from fixing small local ledgers to orchestrating much more dangerous maneuvers. My company specialized in distressed asset acquisitions, corporate restructuring, and hostile debt takeovers. I hired 45 elite professionals to execute this vision. I recruited a brilliant data analyst named Marcus, who preferred complex algorithms over human interaction. I brought on a lead counsel named Elena, who treated contract law like a blood sport. Former federal auditors joined my ranks. We targeted over-leveraged companies, bought their failing loans for pennies on the dollar, and either liquidated their remaining assets or forced them into highly profitable compliance structures. We were moving massive fortunes across the American Southwest daily. Despite this huge influx of capital, my identity remained completely hidden. My name appeared nowhere on the public registry. If a curious party searched our corporate website, they found only stock photos of commercial buildings and generic mission statements regarding fiscal efficiency. The managing partner was listed merely as B. Jones. I engineered the paperwork exactly that way. I drove a silver Honda Accord featuring a noticeable dent on the rear bumper. I wore off-the-rack navy blazers and sensible flat shoes. I leased a modest townhouse registered under a blind trust. I refused to purchase a sprawling mansion. I declined invitations to join elite country clubs. I ate homemade lunches at my workstation while reviewing endless financial disclosures. I realized very early in my career that displaying wealth transforms you into a target. True authority does not require a luxury vehicle or a diamond-encrusted handbag. It requires absolute leverage. I desired the kind of control that operates entirely unseen. While I accumulated actual equity, my former relatives accumulated nothing but obligations. I treated Richard, Patricia, and Jessica as an involuntary case study in fiscal negligence. I tracked their descent through public property records, court filings, and their own boastful social media profiles. The monitoring proved incredibly easy. They lived their entire lives performing for an invisible audience. Jessica posted daily updates showcasing a manufactured reality. She uploaded pictures highlighting first-class flights to Tuscany, matched designer luggage sets, and champagne brunches at five-star resorts. David posed beside her, wearing custom-tailored suits he clearly had not purchased with his own earnings. They projected an image of absolute triumph to their peers. But mathematics always tell a different story. I understood exactly how to read the metadata of their impending ruin. I ran routine background assessments on that pristine Scottsdale address. Richard and Patricia were slowly drowning. That second mortgage they secured to fund Jessica's retail boutique was bleeding them completely dry. When the interest rates adjusted upward, their monthly minimum payments ballooned to unsustainable heights. Richard took out a third line of credit just to maintain his prestigious standing at the Desert Mountain Golf Club. Patricia opened secret accounts under her maiden name to continue purchasing the silk dresses and catered dinners necessary to impress her social committee. They shifted liabilities from one column to another, constructing a towering house of cards over a massive sinkhole. They firmly believed they were wealthy simply because they possessed high borrowing thresholds. They failed to understand that a limit is merely a leash held by a bank. I sat in my corner office overlooking the sprawling grid below and reviewed my own flawless balance sheets. My firm owned commercial plazas, medical facilities, and regional shipping fleets. We carried 0 unsecured obligations. Every decision I authorized was strictly calculated, stripped of messy emotion, and anchored in cold logic. The people who raised me had discarded me like garbage because I asked for my rightful college fund. They deemed me an unacceptable burden. Now I controlled enough liquid resources to purchase their entire gated community and bulldoze it into a parking lot. Yet I did nothing. I never reached out. I never taunted them with my sudden success. I simply watched them dig their own financial graves. People frequently misunderstand the concept of vengeance. They envision loud confrontations, thrown drinks, and dramatic monologues delivered during holiday dinners. That represents amateur behavior. Real retribution requires patience. It sits quietly at the back of the room, holding the undeniable receipts. It waits patiently for the people who scream the loudest to eventually run out of breath and resources. I knew their collapse was mathematically inevitable. I did not need to push them off the cliff. I merely needed to stand firmly at the bottom, holding a net made of binding legal contracts, completely ready to catch whatever assets survived their long fall. My silence remained my most devastating tactic. If you have ever watched an arrogant person slowly destroy their own life while bragging about their success, you know exactly how satisfying that silence can feel. Leave a comment below if you have ever chosen to sit back and let karma do the heavy lifting. I read every single response. I plan to remain a ghost indefinitely. I intended to let the lenders foreclose on Richard and Patricia when their final payments ultimately bounced. I wanted strangers to evict them from that precious stucco residence. But fate possesses a strange habit of altering the board when you least expect it. The shift did not arrive in the form of a bank notice. It came from the only person sharing my bloodline who had ever treated me with genuine respect. It was late November. The blistering desert heat had finally cooled into a manageable breeze. I sat at my oak table finalizing the acquisition of a failing logistics firm. My private cell phone vibrated against the polished wood surface. I recognized the incoming digits immediately. It was Aunt Vivian. She had not contacted me in several months. We usually maintained a schedule of brief conversations every few weeks where she updated me regarding her garden, and I assured her I was eating enough vegetables. This contact felt remarkably different. The vibration itself seemed to carry a heavy, ominous urgency. I picked up the device and pressed the speaker to my ear. "Aunt Vivian," I answered cheerfully. Her breathing sounded incredibly shallow, heavily labored, as if drawing air required immense physical effort. "Bella," she whispered. Her voice lacked its usual fierce resonance. It sounded brittle, like dry leaves scraping across a concrete driveway. "I need you to come to Phoenix. Do not go to your headquarters tomorrow. Come straight to my house, right now." I stood up instantly. My leather chair rolled backward and slammed against the glass wall of my suite. "What is wrong? Are you hurt? Do I need to dispatch an emergency vehicle to your location?" "No hospitals," she commanded sharply, a brief flash of her old iron will pushing through the frailty. "The specialists have already told me exactly what I need to know. I received a diagnosis this morning. The prognosis is terrible." I gripped the edge of my workstation. I felt the smooth wood grain pressing hard under my fingernails. "What exactly do you mean?" "I do not have much time left," Bella Vivian stated, her tone turning entirely pragmatic. "And Richard has already started asking suspicious questions about my property deeds. He thinks my mind is slipping. He genuinely believes I am weak enough to manipulate." She paused, letting out a long, ragged exhale that echoed through the receiver. "He thinks he is going to take my home to pay off his mounting debts. I need your corporate legal team right now. We are going to build a vault that my brother can never crack." I arrived at Aunt Vivian's house less than 40 minutes after she ended her call. Elena, my lead corporate counsel, sat in the passenger seat of my Honda. Elena treated contract law like a battlefield. She brought a portable printer, a stack of blank legal folios, and a digital notary seal. We did not know exactly how much time we had left. Dementia is a thief that steals people in fractions. We needed to lock the doors before the thief took everything. Vivian lived in a pristine, mid-century modern home near Camelback Mountain. She purchased it in the 1970s. The architecture featured sharp angles, floor-to-ceiling glass, and exposed timber beams. It was a masterpiece of design. I knew my father viewed it simply as a teardown lot. He wanted to bulldoze her history to build a speculative luxury mansion. Vivian sat at her teak dining table. She wore a tailored linen blouse and her signature silver watch. She looked entirely lucid, but her hands gripped her coffee mug with white knuckles. She explained her diagnosis: early-stage vascular dementia. Her neurologist told her the decline would be unpredictable. Some weeks she would be sharp and clear. Other days she might not remember her own address. "Richard visited me yesterday," Vivian said, her tone devoid of emotion. He did not ask how I felt. He brought a real estate appraiser with him. They walked around my backyard, pointing at the property lines. Then Richard casually placed a general power of attorney on my kitchen counter and suggested I sign it to make things easier for everyone. He even opened my mail while I was making tea. I looked at Elena. Elena opened her briefcase and arranged her documents on the teak wood. "We are going to make things very difficult for him," Elena stated. For the next 3 hours, we transformed Vivian's dining room into a corporate war room. Elena drafted an irrevocable living trust. This specific legal instrument serves as an impenetrable vault. Once an asset goes inside, it ceases to belong to the individual. It belongs to the trust entity. Probate courts cannot touch it. Next of kin cannot claim it. Vivian transferred the deed to her mid-century home directly into the trust. She then authorized the transfer of her entire investment portfolio, slightly over $2 million in municipal bonds and blue-chip stocks. She named me as the sole successor trustee and the sole beneficiary. To ensure my parents could never challenge the documents, Elena arranged for a certified neurologist to visit the house that exact same afternoon. We paid an exorbitant rush fee to secure his time. The doctor administered a rigorous cognitive capacity evaluation. Vivian answered every question flawlessly. She identified the current date, the president, her assets, and her deliberate intent to exclude her brother from her estate. The doctor signed a sworn affidavit confirming her full legal competence. Vivian gathered the thick stack of papers. She slid them into a heavy manila folder. She pushed the folder across the table. "When they come for the house," she told me, her eyes locking onto mine, "let the paperwork do the talking." I promised her I would. I drove straight to my headquarters and locked the folder inside a fireproof corporate safe. The shield was forged. We finished it just in time. The disease accelerated far faster than any of the medical specialists predicted. Within 6 months, the fierce, independent woman who handed me that $5,000 check years ago began to fade. The bad days quickly outnumbered the good. She started leaving the front door wide open. She forgot to turn off the gas stove. She needed continuous supervision to stay safe. Richard and Patricia finally swooped in. They acted under the assumed authority of next of kin, believing they would soon control her wealth. They did not consult me. They did not know I existed in any meaningful capacity. They drove to her house, packed a single suitcase of her clothes, and relocated her to a state-run nursing facility on the outskirts of Maricopa County. They chose the cheapest option available. They wanted to preserve her liquid assets. Every dollar spent on Vivian's comfort was a dollar subtracted from their anticipation inheritance. They viewed her medical care as an unnecessary expense, hindering their future payday. I discovered her relocation through a neighbor who possessed my contact information. I drove to the state facility the following Tuesday. The conditions turned my stomach cold. Fluorescent tubes flickered over scuffed vinyl floors. The hallways smelled of stale urine and boiled cabbage. Patients sat in wheelchairs facing blank walls, ignored by overworked staff members. I found my aunt in a cramped, windowless room shared with 3 strangers. She wore a thin hospital gown. She looked terrified and confused. I did not call my father to argue. Arguing provides an opponent with a chance to prepare a defense. I walked directly to the administration desk. I presented my driver license and the healthcare proxy Elena had embedded within the trust documents. The facility director reviewed the paperwork, realized he had no legal ground to stop me, and stepped aside. I packed Vivian's single suitcase. I wrapped a warm fleece blanket around her shoulders and guided her to my car. I moved her into an elite, private memory care estate in Scottsdale later that same afternoon. The contrast was staggering. The estate featured private sunlit suites, lush courtyard gardens, and a ratio of one specialized nurse for every 2 residents. The dining room served chef-prepared meals on porcelain plates. Classical music played softly through hidden speakers. The staff treated the residents with profound dignity and endless patience. The cost was $12,000 every single month. I paid the invoice out of pocket. I routed the funds through a blind, limited liability company so the payments could never be traced back to my name. I wanted Richard and Patricia to remain entirely in the dark. My parents never noticed she was gone. They never visited the state facility to check on her well-being. They dropped her off and washed their hands of the burden. Patricia spent her weekends at the country club, accepting sympathy from her wealthy social circle. I heard the stories through the local grapevine. Patricia would sigh, sip her mimosa, and talk about the agonizing emotional toll of having a sick relative. She played the role of the devoted, heartbroken sister-in-law while refusing to spend 10 minutes actually sitting by Vivian's bedside. Richard was busy meeting with contractors. He began drawing up blueprints for the mid-century lot. He planned to tear down Vivian's home the moment she took her last breath. He assumed the property would automatically pass to him through intestacy laws, since Vivian had no husband and no children. He spent hours calculating his projected profit margins. He bragged to his golf partners about the lucrative real estate deal he was about to close. I visited Vivian every Sunday. I brought her fresh orchids. I sat in the plush armchair in her private suite and read books out loud to her. Sometimes she knew my name. Sometimes she thought I was a friendly nurse. It did not matter. She was safe, she was warm, and she was protected from the people who viewed her life merely as a waiting period for a deposit. I sat in my corner office on Monday mornings, sipping sparkling water and looking at the heavy steel safe in the corner of the room. Inside rested the manila folder. It contained the deed, the trust, and the sworn medical evaluation. It represented a financial trap set to snap shut the moment my father tried to claim his unearned prize. He thought he held all the cards. He thought he had outsmarted a dying woman. He believed he had successfully secured his financial future by neglecting his own sister. He had no idea that the daughter he threw away 12 years ago was the person currently paying for Vivian's luxury care. He had no idea that the property he was trying to develop already belonged to a corporate entity he could never touch. I let him dream. I let him draft his blueprints and secure his preliminary zoning permits. I let Patricia accept the fake condolences from her friends. I understood that a trap only works if the prey walks into it willingly. I needed them to commit fully to their greed. I needed them to spend their dwindling funds on architectural plans. I needed them to stand in public and claim their victory. Only then would I open the safe. The waiting required supreme discipline. It required me to suppress the urge to expose their cruelty prematurely. But I had spent my entire life learning how to wait. I learned patience in a hot diner uniform. I learned endurance while studying balance sheets in a studio apartment. I could wait a little longer. Aunt Vivian's health continued to decline as the desert heat transitioned into autumn. The nurses at the estate warned me that her heart was growing weak. I prepared myself for the inevitable goodbye. I knew the moment she passed away, Richard and Patricia would sprint to grab the keys to her house. The quiet phase of my strategy was ending. The true conflict was about to begin. Aunt Vivian passed away on a quiet Thursday in late October. Her heart simply slowed down and stopped during the night. The nurses at the memory care estate called me at dawn. I drove over while the streets were still dark, packed her few remaining clothes, and sat in her quiet room watching the sun come up over the desert. I mourned the only person in my bloodline who had ever looked at me and seen a future worth funding. The funeral took place the following Tuesday. Arizona autumns usually carry a dry heat, but a rare storm had rolled through the night before. The ground at the cemetery was soaked. The folding chairs set up near the gravesite sank an inch into the dark mud. The air smelled of wet sage and turned earth. I stood in the front row wearing a simple navy dress. I paid for the service myself, choosing a mahogany casket and a modest spray of white lilies. Richard, Patricia, and Jessica arrived 20 minutes late. The priest was already reading the opening prayer when I heard their shoes crunching on the gravel path. They did not rush. They walked with the leisurely pace of people attending a mandatory social function. Patricia wore a tailored black suit and oversized designer sunglasses, shielding her eyes from a sun that was hidden behind thick gray clouds. Richard wore his golf club blazer. Jessica walked a few steps behind them, checking her phone screen. They did not approach the front row. They stood near the back, keeping their expensive shoes out of the mud. During the eulogy, I glanced over my shoulder. Patricia was not looking at the casket. She was leaning toward Richard, her hand covering her mouth, as she whispered something into his ear. Richard nodded, his eyes scanning the small gathering of Vivian's former neighbors and retired teaching colleagues. He was taking inventory. He was calculating how quickly he could wrap up this unpleasant obligation and get to the business of the estate. The reception was held in a small community hall attached to Vivian's old parish. The room smelled of old coffee and floor wax. I stood near the catering table holding a styrofoam cup of water, thanking the neighbors who had come to pay their respects. I watched my family work the room. They played the role of the grieving relatives perfectly for the audience. Patricia dabbed the corner of her sunglasses with a tissue whenever someone offered condolences. Richard shook hands and spoke in a hushed, solemn register. They acted like they had been visiting Vivian every week, rather than abandoning her in a state-run ward months ago. An hour into the reception, the crowd thinned out. The neighbors began driving home. The hall grew quiet. That was when the performance ended. I was setting my empty cup on the table when the air shifted. I felt them approach before I turned around. Patricia stepped right into my personal space. Richard flanked her on the left. Jessica stood on the right, her arms crossed over her chest. They formed a physical blockade, trapping me against the edge of the catering table. Patricia did not offer a hug. She did not ask how I was holding up. She reached into her designer purse, pulled out a small notepad, and then held out her other hand, palm facing up. "We need the keys to Vivian's house today, Bella," Patricia stated. Her voice held no trace of the sorrow she had been projecting 10 minutes earlier. It was brisk, transactional, and stripped of all pretense. I looked at her outstretched hand. The nails were painted a flawless crimson. I kept my hands at my sides. "Why do you need the keys, Patricia?" Richard stepped forward, invading my space further. "Because I am her brother. I am the next of kin. The house belongs to me now, and we need to get inside to prepare it for the market." He spoke to me the same way he spoke to service workers who brought him the wrong order. He expected immediate compliance. He believed his title as brother granted him supreme authority, overriding the fact that he had ignored her existence for the last year of her life. Patricia tapped her fingernail against her notepad. "We already have a cash buyer lined up. A developer Richard knows from the club wants the lot. He is willing to close in 2 weeks. We need this sale to process immediately to help Jessica pay off her boutique debt. The bank is threatening to seize her retail space by the end of the month." I looked at Jessica. She refused to meet my eyes. She stared at the wall behind my head, looking entirely bored by the conversation. She had driven her business into the ground through sheer incompetence, and now she expected a dead woman's home to serve as her personal bailout fund. They had planned this before Vivian's heart had even stopped. They had negotiated a real estate deal while she was taking her final breaths in a bed they refused to visit. The sheer entitlement of it settled in my chest, replacing the grief with a cold, sharp clarity. Family takes care of family. Bella Patricia added recycling, the phrase she had used to demand my savings years ago. "Hand over the keys. We have contractors waiting to meet us at the property at 4 o'clock to estimate the demolition costs." They wanted to tear down the mid-century home Vivian loved. They wanted to erase her history and pave over her garden to cover Jessica's unpaid invoices. I took a slow breath. I did not shrink against the table. I straightened my posture and looked my mother directly in the eyes. "The house is not yours to sell, Patricia." My voice was quiet. It did not shake. It carried the finality of a closing door. Patricia lowered her hand. Her pristine social mask slipped, revealing the raw calculation underneath. "What are you talking about?" Richard's face flushed a deep, mottled red. The veins in his neck pushed against his shirt collar. He leaned in so close, I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "I am her brother," he shouted. The sudden volume startled a custodian sweeping near the exit. "You have no legal standing here. You are an uneducated waitress who ran away from her own family. You possess zero rights to that property. I am the legal heir." I did not raise my voice to match his. Matching a loud person only validates their noise. I looked at the man who had thrown my belongings onto a scorching sidewalk 12 years ago. He genuinely believed I was still that terrified girl. He had no idea he was speaking to a woman who restructured corporate debt for a living. I picked up my purse from the table. I slung the strap over my shoulder. "I am not having this conversation with you, Richard." I stepped sideways, bypassing his blockade. Jessica scoffed loudly, stepping out of my way as if my proximity might ruin her dress. "You give me those keys right now," Patricia hissed, reaching out to grab my arm. I pulled my arm back before her fingers could make contact. I gave her a look that froze her in place. I walked down the center aisle of the community hall, my flat shoes making steady, rhythmic sounds against the linoleum. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the damp afternoon air. The gravel parking lot was nearly empty. My practical sedan was parked near the exit. I walked toward it, unlocking the doors with my key fob. "Bella!" The shout echoed across the parking lot. I turned around. Richard had followed me outside. He stood on the top step of the community hall, his blazer flapping in the wind. His fists were clenched at his sides. "If you try to steal this from us, I will destroy you in court," Richard screamed. His voice cracked with the force of his rage. "I will hire the best lawyers in this state, and I will bankrupt you. You will walk away with nothing." I stood by my car door. I did not yell back. I did not explain the irrevocable trust. I did not mention the capacity evaluations, the legal deeds, or the fireproof safe sitting in my corporate office. You do not show your opponent the blueprint of the fortress before they declare war. You let them exhaust their resources, attacking a wall they cannot breach. I opened my car door, slid into the driver's seat, and turned the ignition. I drove out of the gravel lot, leaving my father standing on the steps, screaming threats into the wind. He believed he was intimidating me. He believed his promised lawsuit would force me to surrender. He had no idea that his threat was the exact catalyst I had been waiting for. The trap was already set, the steel jaws pulled back and waiting. Now all I had to do was let him step onto the trigger. The smear campaign started 48 hours after I left them standing in the damp gravel of the cemetery parking lot. When you strip a narcissist of their immediate control, they do not reflect on their behavior. They immediately seek an audience to validate their victimhood. My parents needed to control the narrative before I had a chance to expose their greed. They assumed I would try to tell my side of the story. They did not know I had no intention of speaking to anyone. Patricia launched her offensive at the exact center of her social universe. She drove her least luxury SUV to the Scottsdale Country Club on a Thursday afternoon. She secured a table on the shaded patio overlooking the 18th hole, a spot highly visible to anyone walking toward the dining room. She invited 3 women from her social committee. These were women who traded local gossip like currency, treating other people's tragedies as afternoon entertainment. My mother did not start crying right away. She ordered a mimosa, picked at a kale salad, and waited for someone to ask how she was holding up after Vivian died. When the question finally arrived, Patricia lowered her chin and let her voice tremble. She pressed a linen napkin to the corner of her eye, careful not to smudge her expensive mascara. "It is not just losing Vivian," Patricia whispered, leaning forward so the other women had to lean in to hear her. "It is Bella." She spun a masterful, devastating fiction. She told her friends that I had arrived at the funeral demanding money. She claimed I was a destitute grifter living in a squalid apartment, desperate for cash to fund a reckless lifestyle. She fabricated a detailed story about me breaking into Vivian's mid-century house during her final weeks and stealing a personal checkbook. Patricia sighed heavily, staring into her glass, and said they were trying to handle the situation internally to avoid having me arrested. The ladies gasped. They touched their pearls. They offered their profound sympathies to the poor, suffering mother who had to deal with such a treacherous daughter. Within 3 hours, that story leaped from the patio table to the tennis courts and then straight into the local salons. Patricia did not stop at the country club. The next morning, she walked through the heavy wooden doors of St. Jude Parish. She requested a private meeting with Father Thomas. She sat in his modest office and painted a deeply tragic picture of my mental state. She claimed I was suffering from severe psychological illness, prone to delusions and erratic behavior. She asked the priest to pray for my soul. This specific lie served a brilliant tactical purpose. By branding me as mentally unstable, Patricia built a firewall against the truth. If I ever tried to tell anyone in Scottsdale that my parents had stolen my college fund or that they had abandoned Vivian in a state-run ward, the community would simply shake their heads in pity. They would whisper that I was unwell, writing off my facts as the sad ramblings of a disturbed mind. While Patricia handled the local ground war, my sister Jessica launched an aerial assault on social media. Jessica craved digital validation the way a starving person craves bread. Her failed boutique had cost her significant social standing, and she needed a fresh angle to regain her followers' attention. She posted a black and white photograph of Vivian from 10 years ago. Underneath the image, Jessica typed a long, emotionally charged caption. She wrote about the heavy burden of protecting vulnerable seniors from estranged, greedy children who only surface when an estate is on the line. She did not use my name, but in a town like ours, she did not need to. She used hashtags about elder abuse awareness and family loyalty. The post generated hundreds of likes within a single day. Her comment section filled with heart emojis and outraged messages from people praising Jessica for her bravery. She sat in her living room, refreshing her screen every 10 minutes, soaking up the unearned praise. She fed on the sympathy, using it to mask the terrifying reality that her own house was currently sinking under the weight of defaulted loans. The rumors spread through the desert community like a wildfire fed by dry winds. I expected the social damage. I knew how small towns operated, even wealthy ones. But I underestimated how far the smoke would travel. My corporate headquarters sat in downtown Phoenix, functioning as a fortress of productivity and discretion. I maintained strict boundaries between my personal history and my professional empire. Yet poison always finds a crack in the wall. On a Tuesday morning, my office phone rang. The caller ID displayed the name of a mid-tier vendor who supplied secure data storage servers for Cactus Financial. We had signed a lucrative contract with them 3 months prior. The owner of the supply firm, a man named Gregory, sounded incredibly nervous when I answered. He cleared his throat twice before getting to the point. Ms. Jones, Gregory stammered. We are conducting a routine risk assessment on our current client portfolio. It has come to the attention of our legal department that you might be the subject of an ongoing criminal fraud investigation involving elder exploitation. I sat back in my leather chair. My eyes locked onto the towering view of the Phoenix skyline outside my window. The lie had crossed city lines. It had mutated from country club gossip into a perceived corporate liability. Gregory continued, his voice tight with awkwardness. Our board is very particular about optics. We cannot afford to associate our brand with a firm under criminal review. We are going to have to terminate our service agreement, effective immediately. A normal person might have panicked. They might have raised their voice, desperately explaining the family dynamic, insisting on their innocence, and begging the vendor to reconsider. I did none of those things. Pleading sounds like guilt. Defending yourself against a ghost only makes the ghost real. I kept my tone flat and clinically detached. There is no criminal investigation, Gregory. However, if your board wishes to terminate a binding corporate contract based on unverified suburban gossip, you may do so. Please send your cancellation notice in writing to my legal department by close of business today. We will process your early termination penalty fees accordingly. I disconnected the call before he could formulate a response. I set the receiver down and took a slow breath. My chest tightened with a sharp, familiar sting. It was the same sting I felt at 13 when I realized my birthday did not matter. It was the same sting from the summer they tossed my belongings onto the lawn, knowing that strangers were whispering about my supposed cruelty, while the people who actually committed the cruelty walked around receiving hugs, felt entirely unfair. The injustice screamed in my head, urging me to fight back. The easiest thing in the world would have been to open my computer, draft a massive public statement, and post the receipts online. I could have uploaded the bank transfers showing my payments for Vivian Luxury Care. I could have published the capacity evaluations. I could have burned their social standing to the ground in 60 seconds. I refused to touch the keyboard. People expect you to defend yourself when you are attacked. Narcissists rely on that expectation. They throw a grenade of lies into your life and wait for you to scramble frantically to put the fire out. When you engage, you give them a debate. You step onto their chosen battlefield where truth matters far less than whoever cries the loudest. I knew something Richard and Patricia did not fully grasp. Social pressure is utterly useless against an irrevocable trust. They were fighting a war of public opinion. I was fighting a war of legal documentation. Let Patricia have the country club patio. Let Jessica have her hundreds of sympathetic comments on the internet. Let my father accept condolences from his golf partners. None of those people held a seat on a probate court bench. Not one of those sympathetic friends could sign a deed transfer. Gossip cannot alter a recorded property title. A rumor cannot invalidate a sworn physician affidavit. Public opinion holds zero jurisdiction over the heavy manila folder locked securely inside my fireproof office safe. I sat at my oak desk and poured a glass of sparkling water. The carbonation popped quietly in the quiet room. I took a sip, letting the cool liquid steady my pulse. My silence was not a surrender. It was a strategic retreat. It functioned as a loaded weapon safety off, waiting for the precise target to step into the crosshairs. I needed them to feel victorious. I needed them to believe their smear campaign had successfully terrified me into hiding. Arrogance creates blind spots, and my parents were blinding themselves daily with their own manufactured triumph. They expected the silence to end with my capitulation. They assumed I would soon appear at their doorstep, beaten down by the rumors, ready to hand over the keys to Vivian's estate, just to make the public shaming stop. When a week passed and I did not call, their arrogant satisfaction began to curdle into frustration. The cash buyer they had lined up for the mid-century lot was demanding a closing date. Jessica, creditors were issuing final warnings. The country club sympathy was not paying the second mortgage. Whispers and lies were no longer enough to force my hand. They realized they needed a hammer to break my defenses. They needed the authority of the law. They decided to escalate the conflict from the social arena into the judicial system, firmly believing the threat of a courtroom would finally crush me. They had no idea they were demanding a match against a woman who owned the entire arena. 2 weeks passed without a single sound from my family. The quiet felt different this time. It was not the passive silence of being ignored. It was the active, heavy quiet that happens right before a predator strikes. My parents had exhausted their social artillery. The country club whispers and the church group rumors had failed to provoke a reaction from me. They needed a larger weapon. The escalation arrived on a Thursday morning. I was standing in my kitchen drinking black coffee. The Arizona heat was already baking the pavement outside my window. The doorbell rang with a sharp, abrupt chime. I set my mug on the granite counter and looked through the peephole. A man stood on my porch wearing a faded blue polo shirt and holding a clipboard. He looked bored, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. I opened the front door. He asked if my name was Bella Jones. I confirmed my identity. He handed me a thick manila envelope, asked for my signature on a digital pad, and walked back to his sedan without another word. He was a process server. My parents had crossed the boundary from suburban gossip into the judicial system. I carried the heavy envelope to my dining table. I sliced the top edge open with a kitchen knife and slid the contents onto the wood. The header on the first page read, Maricopa County Superior Court in bold black ink. The plaintiffs listed were Richard and Patricia Jones. The defendant was me. I read the petition. It was a masterpiece of creative fiction. My parents had filed a formal civil lawsuit to invalidate Aunt Vivian's irrevocable trust. The legal grounds they chose were predictable, but vicious. They claimed undue influence. The paragraphs they had sworn to be true painted a devastating, entirely fabricated picture. They alleged that Vivian had been suffering from severe cognitive decline for years before she signed the trust documents. They claimed I had swooped in, isolated a confused elderly woman from her loving relatives, and manipulated her into signing away her entire legacy. They positioned themselves as devoted, heartbroken family members trying to rescue a stolen estate from an estranged, greedy daughter. The final page contained their demands. They wanted the immediate dissolution of the trust. They demanded that Vivian's $2 million estate revert entirely to Richard as the legal next of kin. And as a final punishing blow, they formally requested the court force me to pay all of their legal fees. They wanted to take everything Vivian had given me and make me finance the robbery. I turned back to the signature block to see who had drafted this fantasy. The name printed at the bottom was Harrison Sterling. I recognized the name immediately. Anyone who handled corporate finance or real estate in Phoenix knew about Harrison Sterling. He was a high-priced, ruthless litigator. He did not win cases by presenting superior legal arguments or uncovering hidden truths. He won cases through sheer financial attrition. Sterling possessed a reputation for burying opposing parties under an avalanche of endless legal motions. He scheduled unnecessary depositions. He filed frivolous discovery requests. He forced normal people to drain their life savings paying their own lawyers just to respond to his endless paperwork. He was a legal bully who banked on terrorizing people into submission. My parents had hired a mercenary. They were paying him hundreds of dollars an hour to crush me. My personal cell phone buzzed against the table. An email notification popped up on the screen. The sender address matched Sterling's law firm. I opened the message. It was not a standard courtesy copy of the filing. It was an aggressive, calculated threat delivered directly to my inbox. Sterling wrote that he intended to expose my fraudulent lifestyle in open court. He stated he would depose my former landlords, my high school teachers, and anyone else who could testify to my unstable character. He warned me that civil litigation is a highly public process, and the local media often takes an interest in elder exploitation cases. The subtext was glaringly clear. Hand over the keys to Vivian's house within 48 hours, and they would withdraw the lawsuit. Fight it, and they would drag my name through the mud until I was bankrupt and ruined. I set my phone down next to the court summons. My pulse did not rise. My hands did not shake. I felt a cold, deep satisfaction settle into my chest. I understood exactly what my parents were doing. They were operating on outdated arithmetic. They were betting their entire legal strategy on a ghost. In their minds, I was still the 22-year-old girl they had thrown out of their house. They pictured me as a terrified, uneducated waitress living in a cramped studio apartment, struggling to pay for groceries. They assumed I had zero resources. They believed receiving a formal lawsuit from a notorious attorney would send me into a blind panic. They expected me to look at Harrison Sterling's letterhead, calculate the crushing cost of defending myself, and realize I could never afford the fight. They thought I would surrender the estate, simply to avoid decades of debt and public humiliation. They were relying entirely on my fear. They had no idea they had just dragged their lies into the one arena where social pressure means nothing. A courtroom runs on evidence. It runs on dates, sworn medical affidavits, and verified records. My parents had brought a knife to a gunfight, and they did not even know the gunfight had started. I gathered the papers, put them in my briefcase, and drove to my corporate headquarters in downtown Phoenix. I bypassed my own corner office and walked straight to the legal department. I knocked once on the glass door belonging to Elena, the lead corporate counsel for Cactus Financial. Elena treated contract law the way a surgeon treats a trauma bay. She was precise, unemotional, and lethal. She looked up from a thick stack of merger documents as I walked in. I dropped the court summons onto her desk. "I have a personal matter," I told her. Elena picked up the filing. Her eyes scanned the front page, dropping immediately to Harrison Sterling's signature block. Her expression remained entirely neutral. She turned the pages, absorbing the claims of undue influence and the demands for legal fees. When she finished, she squared the edges of the paper against her desk. "This is a garbage filing," Elena stated flatly. "The capacity evaluation we secured from Vivian's neurologist 14 months ago makes this undue influence claim dead on arrival. Sterling knows this. He is bluffing. He is trying to force a fast settlement before a judge ever asks to see the medical records." "I know he is bluffing," I replied, "but my parents do not know that I know." Elena leaned back in her chair. She looked at me with the sharp, evaluating gaze that made her so effective in corporate negotiations. "What do you want to do, Bella? I can file a motion to dismiss by noon today. I can have this thrown out before the weekend. I can send Sterling a notice of sanctions for filing a frivolous claim and make him answer to the state bar. We can end this right now." I looked out the window at the sprawling desert grid below. The easiest path would be to crush them today. But ending it now would teach them nothing. If we dismissed the lawsuit immediately, Richard and Patricia would simply regroup. They would claim the legal system was rigged. They would spend the rest of their lives playing the victim at the country club, telling anyone who would listen that I had stolen their rightful inheritance through a technicality. I did not want to just dismiss their lawsuit. I wanted them to bet everything they owned on winning it. I turned back to Elena. "Do not respond to the summons." Elena paused. "You want to ignore a court filing." "I want to let the clock run down to the absolute final minute of the statutory response window," I instructed. "I want Harrison Sterling to think he has terrified me into silence. I want my father to pay Sterling another $20,000 to prepare for a trial he thinks he is going to win by default." I tapped the stack of papers on her desk. "Let them feel victorious. Let them brag to their friends that they have me cornered. When arrogant people believe they are winning, they stop checking their blind spots." Elena smiled. It was a slow, dangerous expression. "Understood," she said. "We will prepare our defense documents, but we will not file a single piece of paper until the deadline forces our hand. We will let Mr. Sterling bill them into oblivion." I walked out of Elena's office and went back to my own desk. The trap was no longer just a concept. It was a physical reality recorded in the county docket. My parents had walked straight into it, and they had locked the door from the inside. They wanted to use the legal system to break me. They had no idea they had just handed me the exact tool I needed to dismantle their entire facade. I spent the rest of the day reviewing distressed debt acquisitions. I analyzed failing businesses, approved restructuring plans, and directed millions of dollars in corporate capital. I did my job. I did not lose a single minute of sleep over Harrison Sterling or his aggressive emails. The board was set. The pieces were moving exactly as I wanted them to. The silence from my end would breed an immense, reckless confidence on theirs. I just had to wait for financial gravity to catch up with them. And I knew the wait would be short. While my parents were busy paying a high-priced lawyer to steal an estate they did not own, their own financial foundation was quietly collapsing. The real discovery was waiting for me in a red folder, and it was about to change the entire game. The silence following the delivery of Harrison Sterling's lawsuit was not empty. It was tactical. While my parents and their overpriced attorney waited for me to panic, I went back to doing what I did best. I managed capital. Cactus Financial did not pause its operations for family drama. We were in the middle of our busiest fiscal quarter, actively expanding our portfolio across the Southwest. My firm operated on a very specific financial principle. We thrived on the failures of over-leveraged people. When individuals or corporations live beyond their means, they inevitably default on their obligations. Traditional banks loathe carrying defaulted debt on their books. It ruins their quarterly projections and draws scrutiny from federal regulators. To clean up their balance sheets, these banks bundle their toxic, unpaid loans into massive, anonymous portfolios and auction them off to private equity firms. We buy these distressed portfolios for pennies on the dollar. The bank gets a tax write-off and clears its ledger. Cactus Financial assumes the risk, but we also assume the legal authority of the original lender. We acquire the right to restructure the debt, garnish corporate revenue, or seize the underlying collateral. It is a cold, mathematical industry. It strips away all the country club pretenses and reduces human pride to a simple equation of principal and interest. I spent my Tuesday morning reviewing a new acquisition. We had just secured a substantial bundle of distressed residential and commercial loans from a major regional bank based in Arizona. The purchase had cleared escrow the night before. I was sitting at my desk drafting the restructuring protocols for the new assets when a sharp knock sounded at my door. It was Marcus, my chief financial officer. I had hired Marcus years ago when Cactus Financial was just a single room. He was a brilliant, introverted data analyst who preferred the predictable nature of algorithms to the messy reality of human interaction. He rarely left his office on the lower floor, and he almost never knocked on my door unless a critical protocol had been breached or a high-value asset required a physical signature. Marcus stepped into my office. He did not offer his usual morning greeting. He did not bring his tablet to read off the daily market yields. He carried a single red folder. In our firm, a red folder designated a Tier 1 compliance conflict. It meant a newly acquired asset intersected with a known liability or presented a unique legal vulnerability that required my direct intervention. Marcus walked across the carpet, stopped at the edge of my oak desk, and placed the red folder squarely in the center of my blotter. He looked at me, his expression tight and unreadable. "You need to see this, Bella," he said quietly. He did not wait for me to ask questions. He turned around and walked out of the office, pulling the glass door shut behind him. I looked at the red folder. The air conditioning hummed through the ceiling vents. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished wood of my desk. I reached out, flipped the heavy cardstock cover open, and looked at the printed ledger inside. It was the inventory manifest from the distressed debt bundle we had purchased the night before. The list contained dozens of defaulted loans, but Marcus had highlighted the top 2 lines in bright yellow marker. I read the first highlighted row. It detailed a second mortgage tied to a residential property located in a gated community in Scottsdale. The principal amount was $850,000. The loan had been delinquent for 120 days. The bank had issued 3 separate notices of intent to accelerate the debt, all of which had been ignored. I read the names listed under the primary borrower column: Richard Jones and Patricia Jones. I kept my breathing steady. I moved my eyes down to the second highlighted row. It outlined a defaulted commercial loan tied to a retail lease in Old Town Scottsdale. The principal amount was $400,000. The business entity listed was a luxury clothing boutique. The loan had been delinquent for 9 months. The collateral securing the loan was the personal guarantee of the business owner, backed by the equity in the same residential property listed in row 1. I read the name of the business owner: Jessica Jones. I leaned back in my leather chair. The smooth material creaked softly in the quiet room. I took my hands off the desk and rested them in my lap. I did not blink for a very long time. My parents had taken out an $850,000 second mortgage on their home to bail out Jessica's failing boutique. Jessica had taken out a $400,000 commercial loan using my parents' house as the collateral guarantee. They had built a towering structure of debt using the same property to leverage over $1 million in borrowed money. They had failed to make the payments. The interest had compounded, swallowing whatever original equity they possessed. The regional bank, tired of chasing them for funds they clearly did not have, packaged their toxic loans into a blind bundle and auctioned it off to clear their own books. Cactus Financial had placed the winning bid. I stared at the black ink on the white paper. The realization settled into my mind with the heavy, undeniable weight of a shifting tectonic plate. I did not just hold the keys to Aunt Vivian's pristine mid-century estate. I did not just possess the legal defense to crush their frivolous lawsuit. I now legally owned the debt on my parents' home. I owned the commercial debt on my sister's failed business. I was their primary creditor. I held the paper that dictated whether they kept a roof over their heads. The terms of the acquisition were ironclad. Because the loans were already in severe default, the grace periods had expired long before my firm purchased the paper. If they missed one more payment cycle, Cactus Financial possessed the unilateral legal authority to initiate foreclosure proceedings on the Scottsdale house and seize whatever remaining assets Jessica held. I looked out my window at the sprawling Phoenix skyline. The universe possesses a terrifying, beautiful sense of irony. Richard and Patricia were currently paying Harrison Sterling a premium hourly rate to sue me. They were funding a vicious legal campaign designed to break me using credit cards and whatever liquid cash they had left. They believed they were hunting me down to claim a $2 million prize. They were posturing at the country club, spinning lies about my mental health, and demanding I surrender my aunt's legacy to cover their mistakes. They were waging a war of attrition, entirely unaware that their own supply lines had already been captured by the enemy. They were digging a grave for me, and they had just handed me the deed to the cemetery. I reached out and closed the red folder. I picked it up, walked across my office, and opened the heavy steel safe in the corner. I placed the red folder directly on top of the manila envelope containing Aunt Vivian's irrevocable trust. I spun the dial, locking both weapons in the dark. I did not call my parents to gloat. I did not call Harrison Sterling to demand he drop the lawsuit. Warning your prey that the ground beneath them is rigged to explode only gives them time to step off the mine. I needed them to stay exactly where they were. I needed them to remain blinded by their own unearned confidence. The legal clock continued to tick. Because Elena had not responded to the initial summons, the court system moved to the next procedural step. Civil litigation regarding contested estates rarely goes straight to a judge. The docket requires the opposing parties to attempt a resolution outside of the courtroom first. Later that afternoon, Elena forwarded an email to my inbox. It was an official notice from Maricopa County Superior Court. A mandatory mediation session had been scheduled for the following week. We were required to sit in a room with Harrison Sterling and my family to see if a settlement could be reached before a trial date was set. My parents had engineered this trap. They intended to walk into that mediation room, corner me with their high-priced litigator, and offer me a fraction of Vivian's estate to quietly go away. They expected to watch me fold under the pressure of their presence. I looked at the calendar on my screen and confirmed my attendance. I would go to the mediation. I would sit across from the people who threw me out like garbage, but I would not be walking into their trap. They would be walking into mine. The legal system requires a mandatory pit stop before a judge will hear a contested estate case. It is a process called mediation. The court hopes the two opposing sides will sit in a neutral room, stare at the reality of mounting legal fees, and agree to a compromise. I did not want a compromise. I wanted a stage. But I had to play by the rules of civil procedure. We were scheduled to meet on a Thursday morning at an arbitration facility in downtown Phoenix. I drove my 10-year-old Honda Accord to the high-rise and parked in the underground structure. I wore the same simple navy blazer I wore every day to my office. I did not bring Elena to this meeting. Bringing a high-powered corporate counsel would signal that I had resources and an active defense strategy. I wanted my parents to think I was standing entirely alone. I wanted them to look across the table and see the terrified 22-year-old girl they had thrown onto the lawn with her belongings packed in garbage bags. I walked into the building and took the elevator to the designated floor. The conference room was sterile and windowless. It featured gray industrial carpet, blank walls, and a long frosted glass table. The air conditioning pushed a steady stream of cold air from a ceiling vent, making the room feel like a holding cell. I took a seat near the door. I placed a plain yellow legal pad in front of me and rested my hands on top of it. On my left wrist, I wore the silver watch Aunt Vivian had given me years ago. The metal felt cool against my skin. The second hand ticked in a quiet, steady rhythm. I sat there and waited for the performance to begin. They arrived 20 minutes late. This was not a scheduling error. Arriving late is a classic intimidation tactic designed to make the waiting party feel small and anxious. The heavy wooden door swung open, and Harrison Sterling strutted into the room. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit and carried a slim leather portfolio. He moved with the hostile energy of a man who was used to charging $1,000 an hour to frighten ordinary people. My parents walked in right behind him. Patricia wore a tailored white dress and carried a designer handbag. Richard wore a golf blazer and a sharp tie. They looked like they had just stepped out of a country club brunch. They projected wealth and unbothered confidence. I knew the truth. I knew the handbag had been purchased on a credit card carrying a 20% interest rate. I knew the golf blazer was paid for by a third mortgage they were about to default on. I looked at their clothes and saw only impending debt. Jessica trailed behind them, tapping on her smartphone screen. She did not even bother to look at me when she pulled out a chair and sat down. Sterling did not take a seat. He tossed his leather portfolio onto the glass table. He wanted to dominate the physical space. He paced a short line behind my parents, looking at me with undisguised contempt. He cleared his throat. "Let us make this quick," Sterling sneered. He let his voice echo in the bare room. "My time is valuable, and my clients have better things to do than sit in a windowless room with a hostile party. We are here strictly to satisfy the court requirement. We have no intention of engaging in a drawn-out negotiation." I kept my hands folded on my yellow notepad. I did not speak. I let him fill the quiet. Sterling reached into his portfolio. He pulled out a single sheet of paper. He flicked his wrist and tossed the paper across the frosted glass. It glided smoothly and stopped right at the edge of my notepad. "My clients are willing to offer you a nuisance fee," Sterling stated. "We are prepared to write you a check for $10,000 today. In exchange, you will sign that waiver, relinquishing your fraudulent claim to the trust. You will hand over the keys to the property, and you will walk away. Take it, or we will bankrupt you in court. I will file discovery motions that will cost you thousands of dollars just to read. You will spend the next 5 years drowning in legal debt." Patricia leaned forward. She placed her elbows on the table and looked at me. Her expression was a mask of cold pity. "Take the money, Bella," Patricia said. Her voice carried the same sharp edge she used the day she packed my bags. "It is more than a high school dropout deserves. You have no education. You have no career. You are out of your depth. If you force your father to take this to trial, you will walk away with nothing." Richard nodded his agreement. He crossed his arms over his chest. "We are offering you a gift," he added. "Do not test our patience." Jessica finally looked up from her phone. She smirked. "Just sign the paper, Bella. You always make things harder than they need to be." I sat perfectly still in my chair. I listened to the hum of the air conditioning. I thumbed the edge of the silver watch Aunt Vivian had given me. I thought about the red folder sitting inside the fireproof safe in my corner office. I thought about the defaulted commercial loans and the second mortgage. I thought about the fact that the people sitting across from me threatening to bankrupt me were legally my debtors. I possessed the legal right to foreclose on their home and seize Jessica and her retail space. They were screaming threats from a sinking ship demanding I hand over my lifeboat. I did not sign the paper. I did not defend my education. I did not mention the 45 elite analysts who reported to me every morning. I did not mention the corporate headquarters I commanded or the millions of dollars in distressed assets my firm controlled. Defending yourself to a narcissist is a waste of breath. It tells them they have found a weak spot. It tells them their words have power. I kept my hands resting gently on the table. I shifted my gaze from the piece of paper and looked Sterling dead in the eye. I held his gaze until he blinked. "I decline," I said. 2 words, spoken in a calm, flat tone. Sterling froze. His hostile posture faltered for a fraction of a second. He had expected me to cry. He had expected me to argue. He had expected me to plead for a higher number, maybe 20,000, which he would then reject to assert dominance. He did not expect a flat, emotionless refusal. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but Sterling cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. He recovered his posture and let out a harsh, grating laugh. It was an ugly sound, devoid of genuine humor. "See you in court, little girl," Sterling sneered. He snatched the waiver off the glass table and shoved it back into his leather portfolio. He zipped it shut with a loud motion. "We are done here." Richard stood up quickly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Let us go, Patricia. We tried to be generous. The judge will see exactly what kind of person she is." Patricia stood and smoothed the front of her tailored dress. She gave me one last look of profound disgust. "You will regret this, Bella. You always ruin everything." Jessica rolled her eyes, grabbed her purse, and followed them toward the door. I did not turn around. I listened to the heavy wooden door open. I listened to their footsteps move into the corridor. The door did not close all the way. It rested slightly ajar, leaving a crack wide enough for sound to travel back into the conference room. Through that narrow gap, I heard exactly what they thought of their performance. "Did you see her face?" Jessica said, her voice echoing in the tiled hallway. "She looked terrified." "She is going to fold before the preliminary hearing," Sterling replied with confident arrogance. "She cannot afford to retain counsel. I give it 2 weeks before she calls, begging to accept the 10,000. I heard the distinct sound of a palm slapping against another palm. They were high-fiving in the hallway. They were celebrating their flawless intimidation tactic. They believed they had just secured a $2 million victory through sheer force of personality. I stayed in my chair at the frosted glass table. I did not feel terrified. I felt a deep, resonant calm spreading through my chest, the kind of calm that comes when you watch an opponent lock themselves into an inescapable trap. By refusing the mediation settlement, the court procedural requirements had been met. The case would now be transferred to the active trial docket. A judge would be assigned, a formal hearing date would be scheduled. Sterling had just guaranteed that this dispute would be settled in a public courtroom on the public record in front of a sitting judge. That was exactly what I needed. If they had dropped the lawsuit, I would have had to initiate separate foreclosure proceedings against them. It would have been a long, drawn-out administrative process. But by pushing this to trial, they were forcing a judicial review of the estate. They were bringing the spotlight directly onto themselves. They thought my silence was fear. They assumed my lack of legal representation at the mediation meant I had no resources. They mistook my simple navy blazer and my quiet demeanor for weakness. They had no idea I was simply letting them build a towering house of cards directly on top of a major fault line. I picked up my yellow notepad and my pen. I stood up and pushed my chair in neatly. I walked out of the conference room and headed down to the parking garage. The desert heat hit me as I drove my older car out into the Phoenix traffic. I navigated the familiar streets back to my corporate headquarters. My parents and Harrison Sterling were busy planning how they would spend Aunt Vivian and her money. I was busy calculating the exact date I would serve the foreclosure notices. I needed to assemble the binder, the physical evidence that would dismantle their lies in a single morning. The mediation was over. The pleasantries were finished. The real battle was about to begin, and I held the only weapon that mattered. When I walked through the glass doors of Cactus Financial, the energy of the trading floor washed over me. Phones were ringing, analysts were running projections, and millions of dollars in distressed assets were moving across digital ledgers. I bypassed the main floor and walked directly to my corner office. I closed the door and locked it. I approached the heavy steel safe in the corner of my suite. I entered the combination and pulled the heavy door open. Inside rested the 2 files that dictated the future of the Jones family. The manila envelope containing Aunt Vivian and her irrevocable trust, and the red folder containing the commercial and residential debt owned by Richard and Patricia Jones. I took both files out and placed them on my oak desk. I opened the red folder and reviewed the default notices again. My parents were 90 days behind on their second mortgage. Jessica was 6 months behind on her commercial lease payments. Every day they spent paying Harrison Sterling his exorbitant hourly rate was a day they sank deeper into financial ruin. They were funding their legal assault against me using money they did not actually have. They were digging a deep hole, assuming they would soon strike gold. I sat at my desk and began to build the timeline for the courtroom. I did not need emotional appeals. I needed verified facts. I needed a sequence of documents so flawless and undeniable that no litigator, no matter how expensive, could spin a counter-narrative. I touched the silver watch on my wrist again. Aunt Vivian had known exactly what she was doing. She knew Richard would try to steal her legacy. She knew Patricia would enable him. And she knew I was the only person with the stomach to stop them. The court date was coming. I was ready. The night before the court hearing, I sat alone at my dining room table. Outside, the Arizona heat radiated off the pavement, baking the Scottsdale streets under a starless sky. Inside, my house was quiet. Only the steady hum of the air conditioning broke the silence. I did not pour a glass of wine. I drank ice water. I needed my mind sharp. I placed a heavy navy blue binder in the center of the dark wood table and clicked the metal rings open. I did not need emotional speeches. I needed cold, hard receipts. People who rely on manipulation always underestimate the power of a paper trail. My parents had spent 12 years telling stories. They told their country club friends I was a failure. They told the parish priest I was unstable. They told Harrison Sterling they were grieving relatives trying to rescue a stolen estate. Stories are fragile. They bend under pressure. They change depending on who is listening. Documents do not bend. Documents do not care about your social standing or your tailored suits. They just sit there and tell the truth. I printed clear plastic tabs using a standard label maker. I pressed the first label onto a heavy cardstock divider. Tab 1. I placed the certified copy of Aunt Vivian's irrevocable trust inside the rings. It had been recorded legally 14 months ago. I traced my finger over Vivian's signature. Her handwriting was elegant and firm. She had signed this knowing her brother would come looking for her wealth. She had built a fortress out of ink and paper, and she had handed me the keys. I turned the page and attached the second tab. The capacity evaluation. This was the shield that would deflect Sterling's entire legal strategy. The document was signed by Vivian's chief neurologist, proving she was entirely lucid the day she made me her trustee. The doctor detailed her mental acuity, her orientation to time and place, and her specific desire to exclude Richard from her estate. My father was paying a lawyer a premium hourly rate to argue that Vivian lacked capacity. He was funding a battle against a brick wall. I clicked the third tab into place. Bank records. I had printed every wire transfer, every cleared check, every invoice from the private memory care estate. The total sat at the bottom of the ledger in bold black ink. I had personally paid $144,000 for her medical care. I paid for the sunlit suite, the specialized nurses, the chef prepared meals, and the fresh orchids I brought her every Sunday. While I funded her dignity, my parents had contributed nothing. They had dumped her in a state-run ward that smelled of boiled cabbage and walked away to preserve their own inheritance. They had not spent a single dollar on her comfort. The court would see exactly who had taken care of Vivian and who had abandoned her. Then I picked up the final stack of papers, the red folder from my office. I attached the fourth tab at the very back of the binder. I placed the commercial debt acquisition files from Cactus Financial into the rings. This was not about defending myself. This was the blade falling. The paperwork clearly showed that my corporate entity now owned every cent of Richard and Patricia's defaulted mortgages. I reviewed the numbers one last time. An $850,000 second mortgage on their pristine Scottsdale home. A $400,000 commercial loan tied to Jessica's failed retail boutique. The bank had sold their toxic debt for pennies on the dollar, and my firm had been the highest bidder. My parents had leveraged their entire existence to fund Jessica's vanity project. They were 90 days delinquent. If they missed one more payment, I held the unilateral authority to seize their home. They were dragging me into a courtroom to demand $2 million. They had no idea they were suing their primary creditor. I closed the binder. The metal ring snapped shut with a sharp, decisive sound. I placed a neat typed label on the front cover, Estate of Vivian Jones, Defense Exhibits. I left the binder on the table and walked down the hall to my bedroom. I did not sleep much that night. My eyes stayed open, watching the shadows stretch across the ceiling. But the lack of sleep did not stem from anxiety. My pulse was slow and steady. I lay awake absorbing the profound clarity of knowing that a 12-year storm was about to end. For over a decade, I had carried the weight of being the unwanted child. I had absorbed the cruelty of being thrown onto a hot sidewalk with my belongings stuffed into garbage bags. I had worked graveyard shifts at a diner smelling of old coffee, while my sister posted photos of luxury vacations funded by stolen money. I had built an empire in the dark, while they mocked my absence in the light. That version of my life was expiring. The sun was going to rise, and the truth was going to drag them into the harsh light of a judicial record. At dawn, I got out of bed. I showered and stood in my walk-in closet. I selected a crisp white blouse and my tailored navy blue suit. I set up the ironing board in the center of my bedroom. I pressed the iron against the fabric, watching the steam rise and smooth out every wrinkle. I focused on the sharp crease of the trousers. I polished my flat leather shoes. I packed my briefcase. I slid the thick navy binder inside, followed by a legal pad and 2 pens. I closed the brass clasps. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. I saw the silver watch Aunt Vivian had given me resting on my wrist. I saw a woman who had survived the worst her family had to offer and emerged unbreakable. I was no longer the spare child begging for a college fund. I was a CEO, and I was going to let the paperwork do the screaming. I drove to the Maricopa County Courthouse in downtown Phoenix. The morning traffic was heavy, a river of commuters heading to their offices. I navigated the highway with the radio turned off. The silence in my car felt protective. The courthouse was a towering structure of glass and concrete, designed to make citizens feel small. I parked in the adjacent garage, gripped the handle of my briefcase, and walked toward the main entrance. The heat of the morning was already pushing past 80 degrees. I passed through the metal detectors and checked the digital docket display in the lobby. Estate of Vivian Jones versus Bella Jones, courtroom 4B. I took the elevator to the 4th floor. The doors slid open to reveal a wide, polished corridor lined with wooden benches. At the far end of the hall, standing right outside the heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B, stood my family. Patricia wore a dark, tailored dress and a conservative string of pearls. She was attempting to project the solemn grace of a grieving sister-in-law. Richard wore his best charcoal suit, shifting his weight nervously from side to side. Jessica stood slightly behind them, texting on her phone, looking profoundly bored by the inconvenience of early morning litigation. Harrison Sterling stood at the center of their group. He wore a custom pinstripe suit and held a slim leather portfolio. He was reviewing a document, speaking to my father in hushed, confident tones. They looked up when my shoes clicked against the marble floor. Patricia stiffened. Her eyes darted toward my briefcase. Richard crossed his arms over his chest, jutting his chin forward in a defensive posture. Jessica did not bother to look up from her screen. Harrison Sterling detached himself from my parents and walked down the corridor to intercept me. He stopped 3 feet away, blocking my path to the courtroom doors. He offered a smile that dripped with professional condescension. Ms. Jones, Sterling said, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, "I am going to offer you one final opportunity to be reasonable. Once we walk through those doors, my offer of a $10,000 nuisance fee disappears. The judge is going to review your lack of credentials. We are going to expose your estrangement from this family. You will be held liable for our legal fees. You will leave this building bankrupt." I stopped walking. I did not shrink back. I looked at the high-priced litigator who earned his living by terrorizing people who could not afford to fight back. He expected me to tremble. He expected me to ask for a few more minutes to reconsider his generous offer. I shifted my grip on my briefcase. "Are you finished, Mr. Sterling?" I asked. My tone held no emotion. Sterling narrowed his eyes. The smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "You are making a catastrophic mistake." I stepped to the side, bypassing his blockade. I looked past him, locking eyes with my mother, who was watching the exchange with breathless anticipation. "I am making a deposit," I told the lawyer, without looking back at him. I walked past my family without offering a single greeting. I reached for the heavy brass handle of the courtroom door. I pushed it open and stepped into the quiet, air-conditioned gallery. The rows of wooden benches were empty. The judge's bench sat elevated at the front of the room, flanked by the state and federal flags. I walked directly to the respondent's table on the right side of the aisle. I set my briefcase on the polished wood. I pulled out my chair, sat down, and unclasped the brass locks. I withdrew the heavy navy blue binder and placed it squarely in the center of my table. Behind me, the heavy doors opened again. Harrison Sterling strutted down the center aisle, followed closely by Richard, Patricia, and Jessica. They took their seats at the plaintiff's table. They whispered to each other, casting dark glances in my direction. They were preparing to perform their tragedy for the court. They were preparing to call me a failure on the public record. I sat perfectly still. I rested my hands on top of the binder. I listened to the bailiff announce the arrival of the judge. I stood up as the black robe took the bench. The waiting was over. Which brings us back to the courtroom last Tuesday. The Maricopa County Courthouse is a towering structure of glass and polished granite, designed to make everyday citizens feel insignificant. Inside courtroom 4B, the air conditioning hummed a low, steady drone. The space smelled of lemon furniture polish and old paper. I sat alone at the respondent table, on the right side of the center aisle. Across the polished wood divider sat my parents and my sister, flanked by their expensive legal mercenary. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge, a stern man with silver hair and tired eyes, took his seat at the elevated bench. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the docket sheet, and nodded toward the plaintiff table. Harrison Sterling did not simply stand up. He ascended. He buttoned his bespoke suit jacket, shot his cuffs, and stepped into the center well of the courtroom. He radiated a practiced theatrical confidence. He was a man who charged $1,000 an hour to weave fiction out of thin air, and he clearly intended to give my parents their money worth. "Your Honor," Sterling began, his baritone voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "We are here today to rectify a profound tragedy. A tragedy engineered by greed, manipulation, and the cynical exploitation of a vulnerable senior citizen." Sterling paced slowly toward the jury box, though there was no jury present. He was performing for the judge, for the gallery, and for his own ego. He painted a masterful, entirely fictional portrait of a grieving family. He described my father, Richard, as a devoted brother who had spent his life caring for his older sister, Vivian. He described my mother, Patricia, as a loving sister-in-law who wept tears of sorrow over Vivian's declining health. Then Sterling stopped pacing. He turned his body and pointed a single, polished finger directly at me. "And then there is the respondent." Sterling declared, his tone dripping with theatrical disgust. "Bella Jones, a young woman who vanished from her family over a decade ago, a woman who contributed nothing to her household. She chose to alienate herself, living a transient life, drifting from diner jobs to cheap apartments. Yet the moment she heard her elderly aunt was suffering from dementia, she suddenly reappeared. I kept my hands folded neatly on top of the navy blue binder resting on my table. I did not blink. I studied his face, analyzing the structure of his lies. He was building a narrative based entirely on assumptions. He had done zero actual discovery. He believed the story my parents told him because my parents looked wealthy and I was sitting alone without legal counsel. Sterling continued his performance. He claimed I had swooped into Phoenix, isolated a confused, terrified woman from her loving brother, and brainwashed her into signing complex legal documents she could not possibly comprehend. He spun a tale of elder abuse that sounded like a script from a cheap television drama. Your Honor, we are talking about an estate valued at $2 million, Sterling proclaimed, stepping closer to my table to loom over me. Managing a trust of that magnitude requires sophistication. It requires credentials. It requires a fundamental understanding of finance and asset management. He scoffed, shaking his head in mock disbelief. Look at the respondent. She has no formal financial education. She dropped out of her university path. She has no career to speak of. Your Honor, the respondent has zero financial literacy. She is, by every measurable standard, unqualified to act as a trustee. My mother could not resist the spotlight. The urge to participate in my public humiliation proved too intoxicating for her to suppress. Patricia leaned forward in her heavy oak chair, ignoring the basic rules of courtroom decorum. "This one," Patricia chimed, in her voice shrill and loud enough to bounce off the high ceiling. She pointed her manicured hand at me, her face twisting into a cruel sneer. "No degree, no career. She is just uneducated and worthless." A ripple of sound moved through the gallery behind us. Several people actually chuckled. It was a reflexive, uncomfortable noise, the kind of nervous laughter that follows a shocking breach of manners. I glanced at the row behind my parents. Jessica sat with her legs crossed, inspecting her cuticles. She raised her hand to cover her mouth, attempting to hide a distinct, satisfied smirk. My father adjusted his tie, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. They felt victorious. They had finally managed to put their lifelong disdain for me onto the public record. The judge brought his wooden gavel down hard against the sounding block. The sharp crack severed the laughter instantly. "Order in this court," the judge demanded, fixing a harsh glare on Patricia. "Ma'am, you will refrain from any further outbursts or I will have the bailiff remove you from this gallery. Do you understand me?" Patricia shrank back into her seat, her cheeks flushing a dull pink. She nodded quickly, playing the chastised but righteous victim. Sterling cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the room momentum. He wrapped up his opening statement with a flurry of aggressive demands. He asked the court to invalidate the irrevocable trust immediately. He demanded that Vivian's entire estate revert to Richard as the rightful next of kin. Finally, he requested an order forcing me to pay every cent of their exorbitant attorney fees. Sterling turned his back on me, walked to his table, and sat down. He smoothed his silk tie and shared a confident, victorious glance with my father. They had delivered their opening strike. They expected me to crumble. When you spend your formative years being told you are a liability, your nervous system learns how to process humiliation. 12 years ago, standing on a scorching concrete driveway next to garbage bags filled with my clothes, I had cried. I had begged for my rightful college fund. I had allowed their cruelty to dictate my worth. I was no longer that frightened girl. The woman sitting in courtroom 4B controlled a corporate empire. I orchestrated hostile debt acquisitions for breakfast. I sat across from ruthless banking executives and dictated terms. A bombastic lawyer reciting fiction did not intimidate me. It merely bored me. The judge finished writing a note on his legal pad. He set his pen aside and looked down at my table. His expression was cautious, perhaps expecting a tearful, disorganized rant from an unrepresented defendant. "Ms. Jones," the judge prompted, his voice echoing in the heavy quiet. "Do you have a response to these allegations?" That was the moment. The tipping point, the exact second where the pendulum hovered in the air before swinging back with devastating force. I pushed my heavy wooden chair back. The legs scraped softly against the polished floor. I stood up to my full height. I reached down and calmly buttoned the center button of my navy blazer. I squared my shoulders. I did not raise my voice. I did not glare at my parents. I did not match Sterling theatrical volume. I spoke with the calm, measured tone of a woman who owns the room. "Your Honor," I said, keeping my gaze locked respectfully on the bench, "can I tell the truth now?" The judge raised an eyebrow. "You have the floor, Ms. Jones. Proceed." I reached down and picked up the thick, heavy navy blue binder from my table. I felt the solid weight of the paper, the crisp plastic of the tabs, the undeniable reality of hard, verified data. I stepped out from behind the respondent table. I walked across the center well of the courtroom. I passed directly in front of the plaintiff table. My father refused to look at me. Patricia glared at my sensible flat shoes. Jessica rolled her eyes. Harrison Sterling leaned back in his leather chair, a patronizing half-smile frozen on his face, waiting for me to hand over some handwritten emotional plea. I bypassed their table entirely. I walked to the bailiff desk and handed over the first copy of the binder. "I have prepared evidentiary exhibits for the court, Your Honor," I stated clearly. These documents contain certified medical records, recorded property deeds, verified bank transfers, and corporate asset ledgers. The bailiff passed the heavy binder up to the judge. I turned around and walked back toward the plaintiff table. I held the second exact copy of the binder in my hands. Sterling extended his hand, expecting me to place it gently into his palm. I ignored his outstretched fingers. I dropped the heavy binder directly onto the polished wood of his table. It landed with a loud, definitive thud that made my mother jump in her seat. "Inside that binder, Mr. Sterling, you will find the answers to every fictional claim you just presented to this court," I told him. My voice was quiet, engineered to reach only his ears and the ears of the three people sitting beside him. "You wanted to discuss my financial literacy. I suggest you open the file and read the final tab." Sterling dropped his patronizing smile, his brow furrowed in sudden confusion. The air in the room seemed to stall. My father leaned forward, trying to read the typed label on the front cover. Sterling reached out and flipped the heavy cardstock cover open. He bypassed the trust documents. He bypassed the medical affidavits. His fingers found the final plastic tab, the one containing the corporate debt acquisition files. He turned the page. He stared down at the crisp corporate letterhead. He read the logo printed at the top of the page. He read the names listed under the defaulted commercial loans and the delinquent second mortgages. Then his eyes tracked down to the signature block at the bottom of the page, registering the name of the chief executive officer who now legally owned the debt of the people sitting right next to him. I watched his hand freeze midair. The arrogant litigator was about to realize he had just declared war on a ghost, who turned out to be a giant. Harrison Sterling did not open the navy blue binder like a man expecting a fight. He flipped the heavy cardstock cover back with a bored flick of his wrist. He wanted the gallery to see his disdain. He wanted my parents to see their $1,000 an hour at work. He expected to find handwritten letters, emotional pleas, or printed text messages. He expected the desperate scribblings of an uneducated waitress. I stood 3 feet away from his table, my hands resting at my sides, and watched his eyes scan the first page. He looked at the certified copy of Aunt Vivian's irrevocable trust. He saw the county recorder stamp in the top right corner. He saw the date, 14 months ago. His index finger stopped tapping the edge of the desk. He turned to the second tab, the capacity evaluation. I watched his gaze track the paragraphs written by the chief neurologist. He read the clinical terminology, confirming Vivian possessed full mental acuity. He read the sworn affidavit stating she understood exactly what she was signing and why she was signing it. The legal foundation for his entire undue influence argument evaporated right there in front of him. A medical document signed by a licensed specialist is a brick wall in a probate court. Sterling knew he had just driven his case straight into it. His posture changed. The theatrical slouch vanished. He sat up straight. He pulled the binder closer to his chest. My father leaned over, trying to read the pages, but Sterling angled his shoulder to block him. A smart lawyer knows when a case is dead. A greedy lawyer tries to find a loophole. Sterling flipped to the third tab, checking the bank statements. He saw the $144,000 I paid for Vivian's memory care. He saw the zero contribution from Richard and Patricia. The extortion narrative he had just delivered to the judge fell apart line by line. Then he reached the final plastic tab, the red folder documents from Cactus Financial. I watched him read the corporate letterhead, Cactus Financial, LLC. I watched his eyes move down to the list of defaulted loans. He saw the $850,000 second mortgage on the Scottsdale property. He saw the $400,000 commercial debt for a retail boutique. He saw the primary borrower names listed in bold black ink: Richard Jones, Patricia Jones, Jessica Jones. He did not understand the trap yet. He thought it was just a record of my family's financial failure. He flipped to the final page to find the acquiring entity. He read the name of the private equity firm that purchased the distressed debt. He read the signature block of the chief executive officer, B. Jones. Sterling stared at the signature. He looked up from the document. He looked directly at me. Here is what Harrison Sterling knew that my parents did not. Sterling built his reputation by burying ordinary people under endless legal motions. He operated as a senior partner at a mid-sized litigation group. Just last month, a national legal conglomerate approached his group for a highly lucrative buyout. The deal would guarantee Sterling a 7-figure equity payout, securing his pristine retirement. National conglomerates do not purchase smaller firms without conducting a forensic audit of their books. They hire external private equity firms to examine the ledgers, verify the assets, and clear the acquisition. The external firm hired to evaluate Sterling and his partners was Cactus Financial. I was the CEO conducting the audit on his practice. I was the person deciding if his firm was worth acquiring. I held the keys to his entire professional future. I was his boss's boss. The blood drained from his face so fast, his skin turned the color of wet ash. A fine layer of sweat broke out across his forehead. His hands began to shake. It started as a small tremor in his fingers and moved up his wrists. He realized he had just spent 20 minutes in open court mocking the intelligence and financial literacy of the woman who controlled his pending payday. "You are the managing partner." He whispered it. His baritone voice cracked into a thin, breathless sound. He did not say it to the room. He said it to me. "Yes, Mr. Sterling," I replied. My tone held no emotion. "I am." Sterling let go of the binder. His fingers simply gave out. The heavy book dropped onto the polished wood table. The loud smack echoed through the quiet courtroom like a gunshot. The sound made my mother jolt in her seat. The court reporter stopped typing. My father stared at his lawyer. He did not understand the transaction that had just occurred. He only saw a high-priced attorney freezing in the middle of a trial. He saw a man who was supposed to humiliate me suddenly turning pale. "What is it?" Harrison Richard demanded, half standing from his chair. He pointed a finger at me, his face turning a dark, mottled red. "Tell the judge she is a fraud. Show the court the documents are fake. Do what I am paying you to do." Sterling turned his head slowly. He looked at my father. The polished arrogance was gone. The custom suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big on him. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the click. Richard Sterling said, his voice sounded hollow, stripped of all performance, "She is not a fraud." My father gripped the edge of the table. His knuckles turned white. "What are you talking about? Read the file. She stole my sister's estate. She works in a diner. Stop playing games and read the file." "I did read it," Richard Sterling replied. He pushed the binder away from him, sliding it closer to my father. "She does not work in a diner. She is the chief executive officer of Cactus Financial. She is the managing partner of the firm that just purchased the distressed debt portfolio from your bank." Sterling paused, letting the silence stretch across the table. "She legally owns the mortgage on your house. She owns the loan on Jessica's business." Patricia let out a sharp gasp. It was a ragged intake of air that filled the quiet room. She brought both hands to her face. Her eyes darted from the open binder to Sterling, and then finally to me. The pristine country club mask she wore for decades shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She stared at me as if a stranger had just taken my place at the table. She looked down at her designer handbag, realizing the credit card she used to buy it was tied to an account I now held. Jessica let out a choked noise. She covered her mouth in horror. The smug, satisfied expression she had maintained all morning vanished. Her retail boutique was her entire identity. It was her social currency in Scottsdale. She realized the sister she had mocked for 12 years now held the legal authority to lock the doors to her storefront by the end of the business week. Richard stood frozen. He looked at the typed label on the front of the binder. He looked at the corporate letterhead visible on the final page. His jaw worked, but no sound came out. The man who cared only about appearances, who spent his life projecting unearned wealth, suddenly understood he possessed nothing. His home, his equity, his pristine reputation, it all belonged to the daughter he discarded. Up at the bench, the judge turned to the final page of his own copy of the binder. The rustle of the paper sounded deafening. The judge took off his glasses. He looked down at Harrison Sterling, noting the trembling hands and the pale face. He looked at Richard, standing speechless at the plaintiff table. Then the judge looked over at me, sitting quietly at the respondent table, my hands folded neatly in front of me. The courtroom waited. The 12-year storm had broken, and the wreckage was laid bare for the public record. If you have ever waited for the truth to expose the people who lied about you, hit the subscribe button right now. Leave a comment telling me how you would feel sitting in that quiet courtroom. We are heading into the final chapter of this story, and the fallout is something my parents never could have predicted. The judge adjusted his silver glasses. He turned the final page of the navy binder. The courtroom remained entirely quiet. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning cycling through the ceiling vents. The judge looked down from the bench. He fixed his gaze on Harrison Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said. His tone carried the dry weight of a man who dealt with facts, not fiction. "I am looking at a certified medical evaluation proving the deceased possessed full mental capacity. I am looking at a recorded trust deed, and I am looking at a debt portfolio showing your clients are currently facing imminent financial ruin, holding obligations owned by the very person they are attempting to sue." Sterling opened his mouth. No sound emerged. He looked down at the polished wood table. "Filing a petition of this nature without conducting basic due diligence borders on malpractice," the judge continued. "You brought a baseless claim into my courtroom to harass a legal trustee. I am dismissing this lawsuit with prejudice. It cannot be refiled. And I strongly suggest you advise your clients to evaluate their own financial standing before they initiate another frivolous legal action." The judge brought his wooden gavel down. The sharp crack echoed off the walls. "Court is adjourned." The judge stood and exited through the rear door. The bailiff signaled that we were free to leave. I sat at the respondent table. I gathered my legal pad. I picked up my pen and slid it into my briefcase. I did not rush. I took my time, enjoying the slow, steady rhythm of a morning that had gone exactly according to plan. Across the aisle, the plaintiff table fractured. Harrison Sterling did not speak to my father. He shoved his legal pads into his expensive leather briefcase. He zipped it shut with a harsh, rigid motion. "Harrison," Richard demanded. His voice cracked, stripping away the country club confidence he had worn into the building. "What does a dismissal with prejudice mean? What do we do now?" Sterling paused. He picked up his briefcase. He turned to look at my father, and the expression on his face contained no pity. "It means the case is over," Richard Sterling said. "It means you lost. And it means you will be receiving my final invoice for services rendered by the end of the business day. I suggest you figure out how to pay it." Sterling walked down the center aisle. He pushed through the heavy wooden doors and disappeared into the corridor. He left his clients sitting at the table, isolated and exposed. Jessica stared at her hands. The reality of her defaulted commercial loan sat heavy in the room. She knew I owned the debt on her boutique. She knew the bank would no longer accept her excuses. Her retail career was finished. Patricia touched her pearl necklace. She looked around the empty gallery as if searching for an audience to rescue her. There was no one left to perform for. I stood up. I picked up my briefcase. I walked past their table without turning my head. I pushed the doors open and stepped into the wide marble hallway. I heard their footsteps behind me a few seconds later. They followed me out of the courtroom. "Bella!" My mother called my name. The sound bounced off the stone floors. I stopped walking. I turned around. Richard and Patricia stood 10 feet away. They looked frozen, uncertain of how to approach the woman they had discarded. The tailored suits and designer dresses could not hide the desperation radiating from them. They were looking at their primary creditor. Patricia took a tentative step forward. She reached her hand out toward me, the same hand she had used to point at me and call me worthless just an hour earlier. "Bella, sweetheart," Patricia said. Her voice trembled. She forced a fragile, pleading smile. "We did not know. We had no idea you were running that firm. We are still family. We can sit down and fix this." I looked at her outstretched hand. I looked at the woman who had packed my belongings into garbage bags 12 years ago. I remembered the heat of the Arizona sun on my face the day she locked me out of the house. I remembered the endless diner shifts, the broken air conditioning in my studio apartment, the isolation of building a life from nothing. They did not want to fix our relationship. They wanted to fix their balance sheet. They wanted the chief executive officer of Cactus Financial to erase their defaulted mortgages. I kept my hands resting at my sides. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, measured precision of a woman delivering a final audit. "Family takes care of family, Patricia," I said softly. "You are just a liability." I turned my back on them. I walked down the marble corridor. My flat shoes clicked against the stone. I did not look over my shoulder. I rode the elevator down to the lobby, pushed through the glass exit doors, and walked out into the bright Arizona sun. The heat felt clean. It felt like freedom. I spent the weekend resting. I took a long walk through the desert trails near my home. I drank coffee on my patio. I did not think about my parents. I did not think about my sister. I let the silence settle over my life, peaceful and unburdened. The following Monday, I drove to my corporate headquarters in downtown Phoenix. I rode the elevator to the top floor. I walked into my corner office, poured a glass of sparkling water, and sat at my oak desk. Marcus, my chief financial officer, walked in, carrying a stack of prepared documents. He placed them in front of me. "The grace periods have officially expired," Marcus stated. "The accounts are delinquent. The legal department has drafted the notices." I picked up my pen. I reviewed the first document. It was a formal notice of foreclosure for the residential property located in Scottsdale. Richard and Patricia had failed to meet their mortgage obligations. They had ignored the warnings. I signed my name at the bottom of the page, authorizing the seizure of the collateral. I moved to the second document, a commercial eviction and asset seizure notice for a retail boutique in Old Town Scottsdale. Jessica had defaulted on her business loan. Her inventory and fixtures were now subject to repossession. I signed my name on the designated line. I handed the documents back to Marcus. "Dispatch the process servers," I instructed. "Done," Marcus replied. He took the paperwork and left the office. The fallout was swift and measurable. You cannot hide a foreclosure in a gated community. The process server arrived at the stucco house with the terracotta roof on a Tuesday afternoon. Richard opened the door and received the legal binding notice to vacate the premises. The bank seized the property. My firm liquidated the asset. Jessica arrived at her high-end clothing boutique to find the doors locked and a legal notice taped to the glass storefront. The commercial landlord, acting under our debt acquisition protocols, terminated her lease. The imported velvet dresses and expensive display cases were auctioned off to cover a fraction of her unpaid balance. The social consequences arrived shortly after the financial ruin. My parents could no longer afford their country club membership. The monthly dues went unpaid. Their access cards were deactivated. They stopped receiving invitations to charity luncheons and holiday galas. The neighbors they had spent decades trying to impress watched them pack their belongings into a rented moving truck. They lost the pristine house. They lost the luxury cars. They lost the elaborate facade they had built their entire identities around. I learned these details through the usual channels of corporate real estate monitoring. I did not seek out the information for pleasure. I tracked the asset recovery because it was my job. I did not issue the foreclosure notices out of a desire for revenge. Revenge requires anger, and I had no anger left for them. I processed their ruin because it was strictly business. They took out loans they could not repay. They leveraged their home to fund a vanity project. They ignored the fundamental rules of finance. The market simply corrected their errors. Aunt Vivian knew exactly how the market worked. She knew her brother would eventually spend himself into a corner. She knew Patricia would prioritize appearances over stability. She left her wealth in a trust because she understood that true security requires discipline. I honored her legacy by maintaining that discipline. I still visit her grave. I bring fresh white lilies. I stand in the quiet grass and thank her for seeing me when no one else did. She handed me the tools to build a fortress, and I built one strong enough to withstand any storm. Here's what I want you to take away from this story. Love is not a transaction. Loyalty is not a debt you owe to people who treat you poorly. Love does not entitle anyone to your peace. It does not entitle them to your money, and it certainly does not entitle them to your future. If someone requires you to shrink so they can feel tall, they do not belong at your table. Your worth is not determined by the people who failed to see it. Your worth is determined by what you build when you are standing on your own. If you are watching this and you have ever been the invisible child, the spare part, or the family scapegoat, I want you to hear me clearly. You have the right to walk away. You have the right to protect your energy. You have the right to let the paperwork do the talking while you build a life they can never touch. If this story empowered you to set a boundary today, drop a comment below. I read every single one. Hit the subscribe button, turn on your notifications, and keep protecting your peace. I will see you in the next one.